Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Fellows Conference. I just want to start off with an introduction. So my name is Maisie. I am part of our engagement team. So if you've ever been out and about in the zoo and listened to a talk, it might have been me or one of my team. So you'll see me popping up throughout the day. I also would like to encourage everybody to shuffle forwards because we do have some chairs with some stickers on, which are going to be important a little bit later. So if you're sat further back, if you wouldn't mind heading down towards the front, if you see a sticker, sit in front of it. That would be absolutely fantastic. I think the front 3 rows are our most important ones. So big thank you for that. But I just want to begin off with a really big welcome as well. So whilst everyone shuffles down, I'll just get us going. So we are having our first inaugural Fellows Conference, very exciting, and hopefully going to be bringing together ZSL and our Fellows a little bit more and celebrating everybody's work. And we have got a really wide breadth of work that we're going to cover today and be hearing about. So we're all very, very excited. Now, I've just got a few little things to go through. So just some housekeeping, the boring stuff, and then we can get started. So first of all, today's schedule, you guys should all have in your leaflets that you picked up as you've come in. So you can have a look at that. It's also kind of plastered around the walls. And there's a brief overview on there. So starting off with our talks this morning, we've got a lecture and some talks from our fellows. Then we've got our break. And then we've got the fellow talks after that, and then some animal training sessions that you guys can head off to. Then we've got our lunch break and the engagement sessions as well. So you guys might have signed up for those already. If you haven't already signed up for an engagement session, there is a table just out in the foyer out there, so you can fill in your name in any blank spots. So make sure to do that and take advantage of those engagement sessions. Then we will have a break with our youth advisory board, and then rounding off with our final lecture and closing remarks. And then you guys can have, I think you've got a wine refresher at the end of the day as well. So that is the overview of our day, what we're going to be doing. So the fire alarm, I just need to let you know. So the fire exit, ideally go out the back doors there. The meeting point, if there is any kind of incident, is the entrance to Regents Park over there. Toilets, if you need to go, the accessible toilets are just down this ramp and through these doors here, or otherwise just upstairs out in that foyer area. Access to the zoos, if you head out the side door of this Huxley building here, then you can just access the zoos. You can help yourselves to get in there throughout the day if you'd like to. Teas and coffees available throughout the day as well, so where you would have got them from out in that foyer area too. And then the final thing I need to talk through is the way that we can do our Q&As today, and that is through Slido. So this QR code up on the screen, if you want to scan that, get that up on your phone, you can submit questions through to us. We will receive those and then we will answer the ones that we've got any time for. So if anybody's got a burning question to pop through, then pop it on through on there and then we'll answer those when we can. So I'll just give that a little minute just in case anyone's got any questions about the day as we're going forward for now. But other than that, in a minute, I will pass over to our next speaker, but I'll just wait a minute for any questions you might have. I'm not seeing any questions come through for now. So again, if any do pop up, we can answer them a bit later. But for now, I'm just going to bring up Jim Smith, the ZSL president, to give some welcoming remarks and introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Maisie. And I'll thank Maisie and all the other organizers of this meeting at the end. But I just want to say at the start, I just want to thank everybody who's involved in the meeting. I think it's fantastic. We should be doing this. I'm not going to speak for long, but on my behalf, on behalf of ZSL's council, and I can see some trustees here. I see over here, my friend David Jones is here. I saw Richard Kimblin. Richard Kimblin is here. I don't know if there are any other trustees here yet, but there will be some later. So on our behalf, welcome. On behalf of our CEO, Matthew Gould, welcome as well. I just want to repeat what Maisie said, which is how delighted I am that we are having this meeting, and to thank you very much for coming. This is the first such meeting, apparently, no doubt maybe there was something a couple of 100 years ago. Ray Heaton's shaking his head, and Ray would have been here. So So I think it's terrific that we are doing this. Most of us here are fellows of the Zoological Society of London. I want to emphasize the importance of us getting together and meeting in fellowship, something, as I say, we haven't done for years. Among other things I hope we'll do today, including having fun, is to share our love of animals, to discuss conservation and biodiversity, to visit the library and the zoo, to meet ZSL staff, and importantly, to tell me and the other trustees who you'll be meeting what you like about the society and where you think it can be improved. We always want to listen, so do come up to us and tell us. Okay, we have a trustee session at lunchtime where you can ask us questions, but just if you see me, you see David, you see Richard, I was pointing towards Richard was, come and speak to us, because we really want to know how we can make your society work best for you, the fellowship. Okay. I'm now going to introduce Fiona Sach, our first speaker. It's a long introduction, Fiona, so don't sit up yet, quite yet. Fiona is our Zoo Conservation Impact Manager. You'll recognize her from her work with the project HEAT, which stands for Human Elephant Alert Technology. I'm not quite sure what a human elephant is, but perhaps we're making hybrids and chimeras these days, I don't know, with our elephants at Whipsnade. And you will have seen her contribution in The Zoologist about her work with the tamaraw, the critically endangered Philippine dwarf buffalo. Fiona also manages ZSL's Extinct in the Wild program. And this program focuses on the most threatened species globally, depending entirely on zoos, aquaria, and botanic gardens. ZSL holds nearly half, 16 out of 38, of the world's extinct in the wild species, including the partula snail, the scimitar horned oryx, and the socorro dove. Working alongside our partners, we strive to let no extinct in the wild species slip into extinction on our watch. And we're lucky to draw on the strengths and learnings from our conservation team and our science team to support the decisions we make in this area and to learn about these increasingly challenging and biological and social scenarios. Fiona will take you behind the scenes in this work, what we do, and as we approach ZSL's bicentenary year, the opportunity to change the trajectory of these species. It's in our hands, and Fiona's going to tell you how we're working on this. Fiona, that's the introduction. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to talk about our Extinct in the Wild program at ZSL, and this is a really, really exciting initiative that we're working on together. As you can see here on this slide, you can see some of the logos of our partners, and it's really important to remember ZSL can't achieve any of this work that sustainable, oh, thank you, has a relatively sustainable population in zoos or aquariums, botanic gardens, versus another extinct in the wild species that may only exist in a handful of individuals, and yet they're assessed on the same level on the red list. And I think the important thing to raise about these species is that every single extinct in the wild species is in a perilous state, and time is running out for all of them. Generally, they're also founded from a very small number of individuals, and so they do present genetic challenge. That's something we have to overcome and work with, and we have to use emerging and modern technologies and work together and collaborate to achieve that. So that's very, very much why we have our partners and very much why we're working in such a collaborative way with this group of species. And we urgently call for this international effort to enable this progression. And I think the final point to think about here is that there's two fates for all of these species. So we take these species and we put them in the extinct in the wild category. And there's really only two ways that you can go from there. So you can either move into extinction. So zoos fail, aquariums fail, botanical gardens fail, and those species move into extinction, or those species move into downlisting. And so that really puts that responsibility onto these animals and plants that are in ex situ populations, because they really have two trajectories of travel. There are a number of these extinct in the wild species that have languished in zoos and aquariums, and they have sat there for decades and decades. And it's really important that they are not just left in this space and that they are moving towards downlisting. So since 1950, 12 species have successfully recovered into wild populations and achieved downlisting on the red list, and 11 species have gone extinct from human care. So I think that just really brings to us a reminder of how much the clock is ticking for these species and how urgent it is that we do progress forward. So this paper came out in 2023, and I hope some people here have had an opportunity to have a look at it. And it really shone a spotlight onto extinct in the wild species, and it really highlighted the perilous state that they are facing globally. And I'm sure many people here have a far greater history of ZSL than I do, but since London Zoo opened in 1826, we have exhibited more extinct in the wild, or more extinct species than any other zoo in the world. So it's a really important part for our history to think about that, and to think about we have exhibited and had in our collections more species that have now become extinct than anywhere else. So it's a real opportunity for zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens to step up and be proud and to work together to achieve this. So many of our extinct in the wild species have been subject to translocation back into the wild. Most plant species have not. However, there are still 41 extinct in the wild species, so plant and animal species, of the 84 on the IUCN Red List that have never been subject to any form of translocation or any form of release. And some of these species have been held under human care for a very long time. So if we take the example of the Socorro dove, which we're going to come on and talk about a little bit more in a minute, it's had 37 generations under human care over the last 100 years with no attempted translocation to date. So there really is a nexus of opportunity, responsibility, and vulnerability for these species that all come together that exist solely under human care. And it's a real opportunity to work together to prevent extinction and to return previously lost species to the wild. And so here just shows some of the numbers that we're looking at, and some of the situations that we're facing. And I think it's also important to think about the role of our regional associations and the role of our breeding programs. And if we look on a global level, there are no extinct in the wild species that are currently in globally managed breeding programs. And there are 18% of our extinct in the wild species that are not in an EASA EP, so are not in a European breeding program. And if we look to the US, half of our extinct in the wild species are not in an SSP, so an American breeding program. So I think it's just really important to think about that and think about how these populations are being managed. So in 2021, at the World Conservation Congress, the IUCN SSC Conservation Translocation Specialist Group Task Force proposed a motion for improving the process and action to identify and recover extinct in the wild species. And this was officially endorsed through 95% of the governments and NGOs present. And so this is something to really take forward and think about
what our mandate is for extinct in the wild and why it is so important that we are working together for this group of species. So I've painted a bit of a gloomy picture about the state of these species and the perilous situation that they're all facing. And what are we going to do about this? What can we as ZSL and what can we as our partners working together do to solve this problem? So we have come together and formed an alliance, the Extinct in the Wild Alliance, where we strive to let no extinct in the wild species slip into extinction under our watch. Through this global coalition, we will restore the world's most threatened species, leading by example, inspiring and helping others to turn innovative plans into courageous actions. And collectively, our achievements will highlight the potential for responsible species recovery that can yield hope for nature and humanity. I think it's really important that we remember responsible reintroduction, and it's really important that all this work is conducted in line with the IUCN Translocation Guidelines. It's really, really central to everything within the Alliance. So how will the Alliance achieve this? We will achieve this by building capacity and sharing this knowledge, generating knowledge and sharing it within our partners, and creating a dynamic network that will work together. And it's very important that we remember, for some of these species, this is their only chance towards recovery. So if we think about the process, we've got a species in the wild that is facing a really perilous state, and the process that we would adopt during that journey. The first thing to think about is the rescue. So this is the creating of the first ex situ populations, bringing animals under human care, learning to care for them, learning how to look after them, and really learning how to meet their needs. And so this is that rescue step. And I think some examples of that, some of these rescue situations happened decades and decades ago, some are more recent. But if we look at the Chagos brain coral, which I think we're hearing about later today, that's a really nice example of where a rescue has been conducted. Then we move on to the revitalization step. And this is the step where they're in zoos and they're breeding, or aquariums, botanical gardens, breeding and increasing demographic and genetic viability. And so this step is extremely important. This is crucially important. If zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens fail on this step, this species will slip into extinction. And so this is the step where a lot of our extinct in the wild species are at the moment. They're under human care in our zoos, and they're breeding and they're forming hopefully viable populations. So this is the step that cannot be overlooked. And it's not a particularly glamorous step. It's not particularly attractive to our donors and our funders. It can take a really long time, and it can be quite laborious, but it is such an important, critically important step in the process. Then we move to the sort of more exciting step, the release, which is the part that generally is more interesting, it's more media attractive, it's more attractive to our donors, and it's putting these animals back in the wild. And so this is where we get the kind of lovely news stories and a real opportunity for zoos to pull together and shine. But it's really important to think about all the steps that have had to happen to get to that point. And that's very much where our partula program with some of our partula species is at. So we've got various partula species that are routinely being released into French Polynesia, and that's a real kind of opportunity to celebrate the success of a program. But bearing in mind that that program has been operating for over 3 decades. And then finally, we move into the reinforcement step. And so this is the step where species are in the wild, they're breeding, they're hopefully doing really well, and potentially moving towards downlisting on the IUCN Red List. And it's really important to remember with this step, there is still a huge cost often. There's often a lot of post-release support that's needed. There's often a lot of post-release monitoring. That might be in the form of using technology. That might be in the form of kind of very simple and straightforward monitoring. With Partula, we've had some really innovative and really kind of cost-effective methods of monitoring these animals once they're released. And it's, again, not necessarily a particularly glamorous step, but can go on for decades and decades and is really important to ensure the success of these populations. And all the way through, all of this work must be evidence-based. We must use our science to inform our choices. And we must make responsible decisions as custodians of the natural world. So in building this partnership with our lead organizations, we've created some quite ambitious goals and targets for 2030. And really looking at the species that we hope to be working with from both a plant and an animal perspective. We mustn't forget that on the IUCN Red List, there are more plants that are extinct in the wild than animals. 45 plant species versus 39 animal species. And so it's really important that we are sharing and working together, sharing lessons learned between plant and animal spaces. And so our goals are to rescue 20 species, to revitalize 30 populations under human care. So that's within our zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens, to release 10 species back into the wild, and to reinforce the populations of 20 species. And so a really nice example of reinforcement would be our work with the scimitar oryx. And I hope everybody here has had an opportunity to follow some of the press stories on that and celebrate the exciting downlisting of that species from extinct in the wild through to endangered, noting and acknowledging the huge financial investment to that program, and noting and acknowledging the huge time commitment that has gone into achieving that downlisting. So Extinct in the Wild Alliance, this is very much a partnership of organizations, and we very much hope that people will, or organizations will, use the initiative and also contribute to the initiative. And so it's a global initiative. Our lead partners are, as you can see here, the logos at the bottom. We're very much hoping that all of our organizations that come together and join at the varying different levels will have the opportunity to both benefit from and contribute to the initiative. ZSL has recently signed an MOU with these partners, and so it's a kind of a very new and very exciting alliance that we're working in together. And we very much hope and intend to bring in the specialist groups, the IUCN specialist groups, and relevant regional associations to form and join together in this global partnership. So in summary, this is an amazing opportunity that zoos have. It's an opportunity to work together to do very meaningful on-the-ground conservation for species that we are the sole custodians of. And we can also use this as an amazing opportunity to talk to our audiences, to create vibrant, passionate visitor experiences, to be very clever in how we present these species to our audiences, and engage our different visitors and our different demographics. And it really supports and contributes towards our social license to exist. We can use our extensive credibility in science to unleash the potential for zoos and aquariums and botanical gardens globally, and we can support each other as part of a collaborative community. And it's also very important to think about the sole custodians. So this does really place a massive moral responsibility on us to do something, for zoos to write the future that they want to have, and to write themselves into a space where we can comfortably and confidently really live our social license to exist. So if we look at ZSL and our two conservation zoos, we care for 21 extinct in the wild species or subspecies, either within our zoos or there's a couple of species, sea heck, and a couple of partridge species that are not in our conservation zoos, but we manage the breeding programs. And as you can see here, all those species, and as I say, a huge number of these are partridge, so I do encourage you to pop in and see the partridge room today if you have the opportunity. But it really highlights where these species are at along the trajectory of rescue, revitalize, release, and reinforce. And I want to take a moment to talk about how we care for these animals within our zoos and what modern ex situ care looks like. And zoos have progressed hugely in the last 50 years, in the last 100 years. The way that animals are cared for in our collections are vastly different to years ago. We now have a huge amount of science to support our care, and we have ever-emerging technologies that we can use to help inform our choices. Animals can thrive and can be suitable candidates for release and for reintroduction. And I'm going to take the example of Mexican pupfish, which came under human care 10, 15 years ago. And in that time, we've learned a huge amount about how to feed them, how to look after them, the amount of space they require, the life support they need, the seasonal variation within their environment, the water quality, and all of these things have improved massively, which hugely changes how we can look after these animals, how we can breed them, and how we can really contribute actively towards that revitalization step, to have a demographically, genetically sustainable population with surplus animals available to release. Mexican pupfish, and I hope everyone here has had the opportunity to see them at Whipsonade. We've very much moved and are transitioning and moving how we're keeping them. So for example, as you can see in these pictures, moving them into outdoor ponds. And by doing this, it gives them a much better vitality. It now allows us to keep multiple groups within a larger space, so it increases the genetic variability. and it enables them to have a much better resistance to mycobacterium. So it's really, really important for the vitality of those animals. And something to think about for our 200-year history, zoos have been consumers of animals, consumers of the natural world, and how can we now change this trajectory and really conduct meaningful, impactful on-the-ground conservation as we look forward to 2050, 2030. So I'm going to ask everybody now to participate in an interactive story of the Socorro dove. And I want everybody to imagine casting their mind back. The Socorro dove are from the island of Socorro, just off the coast of Mexico, casting their mind back to 1925. So if we think about our ZSL history, Whipsnade, London Zoo has opened. Whipsnade hasn't opened, but in 1925 the land had been purchased, or it was 1 year before the land was purchased. And on the island of Socorro, sheep had been introduced in the late 1800s. So there had been a massive introduction of sheep. These sheep had defoliated the island. They'd eaten a lot of the plants, a lot of the forest land. And so it had really had an impact on the habitat of the Socorro dove. So everybody, please, in their imagination, cast their mind, they're on the island of Socorro. And I would like everybody to please take a moment to have a look at the seat in front of you and see if you've got a sticker on the seat in front of you. And if you're sitting on the front row, on your arm to your left-hand side, to see if you've got a sticker. And if everybody can please take note of the color of that sticker and just remember it for a minute. So we're going to be interactive. We're going to do something fun. And if everybody could please jump up and imagine that you're a Socorro dove on the island of Socorro. Excellent. So it's 1925, you're on the island of Socorro, you're flying around, having a lovely time. You've got this horrific situation whereby the island is being defoliated in front of you. And it's a really awful situation. Your habitat is being destroyed, but you are on the island of Socorro as a wild population of Socorro dove. There are no Socorro dove really under human care anywhere. You're just wild Socorro dove on the island. Now, if you have a red circle with a number on, could you please remain standing? If you do not, could you now please sit down? So we should have 17 people with red circles standing up. So you 17 people represent the very nice Socorro actions. That's very lovely, thank you. You 17 people represent the founding population that are under human care today. So you were captured by bird fanciers in 1925 and brought under human care in the US, and 4 of you came over to Europe. So you were the founding population of Socorro dove. Now, if you have a number, or they all have numbers on, if your number is 1 to 4, could you please remain standing? If your number is 4 to 17, could you now please sit down? So we should have 4 people standing up. Excellent. So could you all give a wave, because you are the most important Socorro dove. Excellent, thank you. So you are the population which founded the European breeding program today, the managed program that Socorro dove are looked after under. And birds 5 to 17, unfortunately, you hybridized with the mourning dove, and so you sort of died out. You 4 people are the founding population of the Iyaza population today. So you are so important. Your genetics have gone on to result in the population that we have under human care today. So you 4 people, for the next 100 years, engaged in considerable conservation breeding. You produced lots and lots and lots more Socorro dove. And so could everybody now please jump back up on your feet, and you are the population of Socorro dove in European Zoo. So everybody, you are the population. There's probably a couple more. We should probably have a few more people here today. But the population of Socorro dove is 167 birds in zoos. So 167, that sounds quite positive. It sounds quite, reasonably sustainable. You are the population under human care in the whole world. There's no birds on the island of Socorro. You are the only birds in the world. So you are generally feeling quite positive to your population. However, could you please sit down unless you have a green or an orange sticker? So, unfortunately, those of you who have sat down, you are the surplus males to the population. So Socorro doves have a problem. Well, Socorro doves have a situation where there is a bias in the population. So there is a skewed sex ratio towards males, and there is an increased survivability of males, potentially due to, as more research is needed, but potentially due to aggression towards females. So unfortunately, you are the surplus males. We now have the female population remaining, standing up. So that's excellent. There should be 57 of you. So that's, again, not terrible, reasonably positive. You're spread over 34 institutions. You're engaging in conservation breeding. That's excellent. However, Socorro dove, under human care, live to their sort of 10, 12, 14 years old. Unfortunately, after the age of about 4 for females and about 5 for males, the breeding success of Socorro dove declines massively. So if you have an orange and a green sticker, could you please remain standing? But if you have only an orange sticker, could you please sit down? So you, unfortunately, are the older females that are no longer breeding and are no longer contributing towards the breeding population. We now have 32 females remaining standing, and you are the active breeding population. So this is the numbers are getting smaller, but reasonably positive. Now, if you have a look at your green sticker, and we're going to now move into a hypothetical situation, but a hypothetical situation that could well happen, or is possible. Unfortunately, at London Zoo, we have had an outbreak of avian influenza. And we have been ordered to cull a number of our birds because of this outbreak. And so if you have a cross in your sticker, could you please sit down because you've died of bird flu? We should have a couple sitting down, about 8 people sitting down. And our next door neighbor, because we've had bird flu, our next door neighbor has also been subject to the same situation, our next door neighbor zoo, and so they've had to cull a number of birds. So this really highlights how these birds need to be spread over multiple institutions so that they are protected against catastrophe. So as we look at the situation, this really highlights to us how perilous some of these populations are. And we think to ourselves, okay, we've got 167 birds, that's reasonably positive. But actually, when we look at our breeding potential of that population and we look at the sustainability of that population, it then becomes more and more difficult, and we're faced with challenge after challenge with some of these species. So I hope this can highlight to everybody, in a positive light, the challenges that these birds are facing, or these species are facing, and why we have a responsibility and why we can use our science and our knowledge to help solve these problems. So thank you to our remaining Socorro dove. You can now sit down. That's really excellent. You are all contributing to the population. So this just summarizes it for us. We had 17 birds that came under human care initially. We had 4 founders in the European population, 167 birds today, 54 females, and 32 are actually actively acting as breeding females. So what do we need to do? We need zoos to step up and to hold birds, and to not just hold a breeding pair, but to hold these surplus males, to hold these extra animals that are not actively contributing to the breeding population, but still have meaningful roles to play in telling our stories and engaging our public and talking to our audiences. We need zoos to step up and hold multiple birds. So we need zoos to be species champions for these birds. We need zoos and other institutions to come together and conduct research into female survivability, into the skewed sex ratio, and into the population genetics. And we need zoos to work together, and we recognize that we cannot achieve this work on our own. So these birds have been under human care for 100 years, 37 generations, and they've been completely off the island for 50 years. So they were completely declared extinct in the 1970s. So as we look towards ZSL's 200-year anniversary, we need to think that there are two equally possible fates for these birds moving forward. And these two equally possible fates depend on our choices. And we need to think, how do we want ZSL and how do we want other zoos to come together to work to support these species? So thank you very much to all of our Socorro doves. And I hope that story really brought to life for you the situation that they're facing within our zoos, and really noting that only our zoos in Europe are within a managed breeding program. I'm going to close now with a short video. I would ask you to, if you enjoy this video, to, when you get home today, go onto the ZSL website. This video is now on the ZSL website, so please share it with all of your friends and family and anyone who might be interested, and really help share the story of Extinct in the Wild and this new alliance.
Extinct doesn't always mean lost forever. Extinct in the wild species have vanished from their natural homes, but still swim, sway, and hold on tight in the expert care of conservation zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens. These are the world's most threatened species, and their survival is entirely in our hands. Together, our science-driven conservation organizations can give them another chance, a life beyond extinction. We rescue and care for last survivors, working closely with governments, NGOs, and research institutes. We share their stories. We revitalize their populations through coordinated breeding programs. Working with local partners, we carefully release or plant them back into safe wild habitats. And even when they've settled back into nature, we stay in touch, ensuring their wild populations are reinforced long to the future. This mission requires a huge, united effort, but we know it works. That's why a new alliance to champion extinct in the wild conservation has been forged. Join us, share your skills, knowledge, or resources, and together we'll fight for the recovery of every single one of these precious species. Let's give extinct in the wild species a second chance. Extinction doesn't have to be an end. It can be a new beginning.
I'd be very happy to take any questions if anyone would like to ask anything, either now on the Slido or at any point. Please feel welcome to catch me at any point during the day as well.
Okay, fantastic. So I just want to say a really, really big thank you to Fiona for that amazing talk. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear about your work protecting the planet's most vulnerable species, and also hearing the bits that ZSL are doing to look after some of those animals as well. So the Slido app that I mentioned before, you can submit your questions through that now. We do have some that have already come in. So we'll start off with those, and then, or if there's one at the front, I can head down if you want to say it into the mic. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, I'll head down and get one from the audience first.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. This hybridization with the mourning dove, it sort of appertains to what I might talk about for 10 minutes later on. If the population of pure Socorro was so low and so inbred in the future, would you ever consider using animals from that inbred, that slightly hybridized population to supplement them in some way? And I say that particularly because some people are talking about using the mourning dove to recreate the passenger pigeon, but that's another story.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I'm not 100% sure so this was in the US that these birds hybridized with the mourning dove. how many of those birds are still living today, and whether there is a viable population of that to really sort of hybridize back with, and the genetic variants from a Socorro dove to make that kind of a meaningful, worthwhile option or not. At the moment, yeah. At the moment, they're conducting genetic analysis of the European population. Everyone's submitting their feathers to do that. And I think that would inform kind of what the situation is and what the best way forward would be from that point. So I wouldn't say never, but I wouldn't say definitely yes.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. An interesting question. I think we've got another one from the front here, so I'll just pass over again.
Is there ever a point where you decide we've just got to give up on this? I'm thinking in terms of the northern white rhino, where there are now 2 past reproductive age females at Old Pejeta in Kenya. They've got frozen embryos, but over about the last 12, 15 years, they've failed to find suitable southern white rhinos in basically to be the surrogate mothers for frozen embryos. Do you have to at some stage just say, we've lost, and actually then put that money, say, into conservation of a close species like the southern white rhino instead of a horrible mixed metaphor, flog a dead rhino?
That's an excellent way of putting it. I think the tricky part is where you draw that line. One would like to end up with a situation where you don't end up with 2 individuals of post-reproductive age. Obviously, it has happened with the northern white rhino. I think you want to do all you can through the revitalization so you don't get to that point, so you have a reasonably genetically sustainable, well cared for, competent population in a zoo or aquarium or botanical garden. I can't comment directly on the northern white rhino because I'm not involved directly with the story, but it is a really hard decision of where you apportion conservation resources and where you apportion funding. I will say most of these extinct in the wild species, to actually keep them under human care is relatively cost effective. Obviously, everything costs money, but to feed and look after and care for, considerably cheaper than any of our, large-bodied mammals. You could probably feed our whole extinct in the wild collection as ZSL several times in the cost of feeding our 7 elephants. So I think it's a really difficult question. Obviously, the releases all cost huge amounts of money, and responsible release costs a lot of money. But how you make that decision about how you invest conservation resources is really, really hard. And also, if somebody wants to invest in that situation, and I don't know the funding mechanism for the northern white rhino, but if there is somebody who wants to fund that and they don't want to fund a partula, that becomes another difficult decision and a difficult discussion.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to hop to one of our questions from Slido.
Okay.
So we have had someone that has been reading our zoologist and knows that you mentioned the work that you've done in the Tamaraw in the last zoologist. So congratulations on becoming the new EEP coordinator, has been added in as well. And could you just give us an update on that and what the Tamaraw is and why it's important?
Yeah, of course. So Tamaraw are a really exciting species that ZSL is working with on the island of Mindoro in the Philippines. And for those who don't know, they're quite an unusual species in that they're a reasonably sized, small Philippine buffalo, about 300 kilos, but they exist only on one island. And there are about 300 individuals in the world. They're a complete opposite to extinct in the wild because there are none under human care at all. And there are absolutely no live animals off the island of Mindoro. And they live in the sort of mountainous grassland areas in central Mindoro in at least 3 populations, but the 3 populations are completely isolated from each other. So it does create potentially quite a lot of genetic challenge. There are 2 reasonably large populations. One is in a protected area and one isn't. And then there is one very tiny population, about 15 individuals. And they live alongside indigenous peoples, about 20,000 indigenous people on the island of Mindoro who live alongside the Tamaraw. And tamarau are threatened by legal and illegal hunting, slightly threatened by habitat loss and impact of climate change, and threatened by disease. So they had a huge disease outbreak of the rhinopest virus in the 90s and massively affected the population. And we are working, ZSL are working with an absolutely phenomenal organization called the De Bobble Foundation. And I would highly recommend everybody has a look at their website if they haven't already. And this foundation, it's a French NGO, but they're working in the Philippines for the preservation and conservation of the tamarau. And we have been involved in a kind of, or we are involved at the moment in a 2-year piece of work looking at presenting the options to the Philippine government for what they could do with tamarau. So whether they could consider conservation translocation, so moving some individuals from where there are more to where there are fewer to increase genetic diversity, whether they could consider bringing some under human care, either as an insurance population or for conservation breeding to produce more individuals to later release, or whether they could consider increasing protection for the tamarau that are currently living in the wild. So whether they consider increased law enforcement, there is a no hunting zone where nobody is allowed to hunt them. So increasing the size of that no hunting zone, or generally increasing either clamping down more on illegal hunting or increasing the areas where legal hunting is not allowed to sort of increase the protection for the species. So that's the work we're doing at the moment, and it will be May next year that we're working very closely with the Philippine government, but it'll be May next year that we sort of present the end of the first phase of this work to the Philippine government and to help them in that decision making. And we're using structured decision making to inform that process. And then we are absolutely delighted. One of our other partners, Rewild, have just secured 5 years of secure funding for the tamarau, and ZSL are a partner on that as well. And that really kind of steps forward the conservation for tamarau, and it really enables this implementing partner to work very securely for the next 5 years to really work towards the conservation and preservation of tamarau.
Amazing. Sounds like a fantastic project.
So no, I would really recommend everybody having a look on Google to that organization. And I guess you mentioned about the EP coordinator. So there are none in Europe. There are none under human care. And so you sort of think, well, why do we have an EP coordinator? And why do we have an EP for them? And I think it's really about thinking about the role that zoos can actually play in working for this species. So we have a lot of expertise that we can share. We can raise awareness of the species. We can provide some funding support. And there is a lot that zoos can do, even though they will probably never come under human care within Europe.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I've got several of the same question coming through on Slido, so I'll come back to the crowd in a minute, but I'll just ask you this one first. And it's all around the genetic diversity of the Socorro dove. So obviously foundation population is quite small.
Yeah.
So people are asking if that's having an impact. And we've also had one question. We may or may not know the answer to this, wondering if it would be possible to artificially create biodiversity to counteract that founder effect.
I mean, Socorro dove are facing genetic challenge, and they did come from, as far as we can understand, 4 individuals. We are seeing healthy birds in the population. So I think, further work and further research is needed to really assess what the genetic challenge is. But we have had 37 generations of essentially healthy birds that are displaying broadly signs of competence under human care. So I think it's really a question of more research is needed to know the impact of that, but at the same time acknowledging that is a challenge that we have to work with within this program of species, and it's something that we're going to have to continually face and overcome as a challenge.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to come to the front because I've seen a hand up for a while.
Thank you, first of all, Fiona, for that talk. That's a really, really good, very simple outline as to why Extinct in the Wild is such an important program. Thank you for that. There's a lot for us all to go away and proselytize about to those who think zoos are places that should be shut down because they're all about looking at animals, which we shouldn't do, blah, blah. A practical question, as I understand it, the Socorro dove was unique to that one island. Then the environment there became unviable for it to survive. So it has been quote unquote artificially conserved through the human means. If you get to a point where you can release a species into the wild, but its only known habitat has been proven to be unviable for it, where and how do you decide to release it?
That's a really excellent question. And I think the best example of that would be the sea heck, so the Guam kingfisher. So the island of Guam is completely unsuitable habitat for them still. They still have the predator, the brown tree snake, which decimated the population. They haven't got rid of that on Guam. It's not been possible to eradicate yet. And so that's when you look at an assisted colonization. And so sea heck are moving to Palmyra Atoll, which is an island that is ecologically very similar to Guam, but it hasn't got the brown tree snake, so it hasn't got the predator. And it's almost like a way of seeing how they get on as a start point, with a very strong hope that one day those animals and those birds will go back to Guam, but acknowledging that at the moment Guam is not safe for them, and how you work towards a point where Guam could become safe for them. So it's really difficult to identify those ecologically similar sites. Extensive survey work conducted to decide that Palmyra Atoll was a suitable opportunity for the sea heck. But balancing that against the problem that sea heck face in AZA zoos, whereby there's a lack of holders, there's a surplus male problem. It's really, really difficult to have anywhere to put these birds. Holders become very disinterested in maintaining them for so many decades when there is no kind of release potential. And so it's kind of balancing all of those confounding factors. It's very difficult to do, to make those decisions about where assisted colonization may or may not be appropriate.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so we've got time for one more question. So I'm going to pass the mic along there in the middle. If we haven't had time to answer your questions, guys, we are around all day, so you can try and grab us to fill in those blanks. But if I could just pass this to you guys, if you wouldn't mind passing it along to the green lanyard.
Thank you so much for that, and all of the work behind it was terrific. And we all appreciate it. And that's why we're here on a Saturday morning in the Huxley Theatre. But my friend has an empathy bypass. He's completely disinterested in biodiversity and wants to know why I'm spending Saturday morning here interested in EW. What's in it for humans? What's the wider benefit? What do I say to my friend to persuade him that there is a point beyond the mere survival of the species? What do we do to persuade those who don't share our interest?
I think acknowledging the role in ecosystems that these species play is crucially important. So yes, it might just be a partula and it lives in a tree for its whole life, but actually acknowledging that individual species is contributing vastly towards ecosystem services is really important. Depending on your friend, you could appeal to his moral side of, well, these species are under human care and have been for such a long time, and we can either leave them where they are to languish and eventually die out, or we can do something responsible about it and give them a second chance. So it depends on their kind of state along that spectrum. But I do think that approach of, well, actually these species do have a role to play in ecosystem services, and okay, you can sit back and do nothing and let them go into extinction, but where are you going to stop that point? If we think about how many species we're losing every week, every month, every year, at what point do you step in and say, well, that's having an impact on the environment and that's a problem? Also, again, depending on the moral stance of your friend, from a cultural perspective, and from a sort of human values perspective, do we want to be the people who are responsible for, sea heck dying out on Guam and nothing else, and then never going back? Partula snails from various islands in French Polynesia never being seen again. We're reaching a point now on Guam where there are generations of people growing up having never seen a sea heck because they had, became extinct in the 1970s. And do you want those people to be that disconnected from nature and from the environment around them? It's really difficult to kind of say that from a sort of global north perspective, but is that really what you want for the sort of future of the next generations to come?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Fiona.
you.
I think another round of applause is definitely in order. Okay, everybody, welcome back. I hope everyone's feeling a bit more refreshed after a little break. You've got your coffees. So we are going to head into our next section now. We have got just about an hour of fellows talk. So we are really, really passionate about sharing our fellows work. So really excited to hear from some of them this morning. So first up, we have got The Lost Words, Representations of Environmental Issues in Children's Literature and the Implications for Environmental Education from Dr. Ross Buckingham from the University of Cambridge. So welcome up, Ross.
Start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome to start proceedings. This is a talk that is very, very close to my heart. It's a combination of research that has taken me far and wide within the realms of environmental education. But I just wanted to give you some sort of contextual background in terms of why I'm here and why this is such an important front in terms of environmental education and what we're looking to achieve within the society. To start off with, just to give you some background, I'm actually head of English, head of house at Shrewsbury House School. It's one of the oldest prep schools in the country. And I have led curriculum areas in 5 countries, and I've actually taught every age from the ages of 3, 4 in kindergarten in the United States, all the way through to undergraduate. While to emphasize the literary links, while my mind's eye is very much focused on English literature, my heart beats loudest within the realms of the natural sciences and environmental education, which has led me to follow in the footsteps of childhood heroes of mine who are actually fellows and former fellows themselves. If anybody in the room who's not familiar with the works of Sir Peter Scott, I strongly encourage you to look into his background and his achievements. When I was in my pram in Gloucestershire, many, many years ago, I had the great honor of meeting him, and he and a gentleman by the name of Sir David Attenborough, who actually referred to Sir Peter Scott as the patron saint of conservation, very much inspired me through my trips to the Amazon rainforest, exploring the Arctic Circle, and a great privilege of following the trail of HMS Beagle around the Galapagos Islands as well. In terms of that passion for the natural world, that has actually led me to continue in terms of my further education, graduating with a master's in philosophy of education, doctor of philosophy education from Cambridge, focusing on eco-criticism, which is essentially a critical idiom looking at literature and cultural products through a critical green lens, as it were, from an environmentalist perspective, and looking primarily at children's literature. I've since become a member of the Commission for Education and Communication at the IUCN, fellow of the Linnean Society, and obviously the Zoological Society. And I've recently completed an MPQ where I've actually designed a program of study in environmental education at the University of London, UCL. Now, all of this I will refer to over the course of this particular presentation, and this context will inform what is to follow. In terms of my doctoral research, the primary aim was to actually conduct both qualitative empirical studies and detailed literary analyses of children's literature that provides representations of environmental issues. I was actually the first person to not only research and critically analyze children's literature with representation of environmental issues. I was actually one of the first, in fact, I think I was the first to conduct empirical research where I actually went into schools and engaged with students and discussed those representations in detail. And I wanted to investigate how these examples of children's literature persuasively model ecologically attuned attitudes and practices to young readers. I also wanted to analyze how these texts open up spaces for children to reinforce, challenge, and augment their own ideas in relation to the natural world and associated environmental issues. To do so, I actually chose 4 texts, and I chose these texts based on their distinctive qualities and their representations of different protagonists and different environmental issues, which are synonymous with the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing. I'm just going to draw your attention to the first of these texts, which is Seeds of Change, which is a text based on the life of Wangari Maathai, who was the first woman and indeed the first environmentalist to win a Nobel Peace Prize for her works in restoring the green belt in Kenya. So that that particular text, I think, exemplifies the way in which these 4 core texts present a variety of different role models, contested values, dilemmas, and perspectives in relation to nature and the epoch of the Anthropocene. Now, I don't just want this presentation to be about me. I want it to be about the children who are actually interviewed. And this was one of the participants, Isabel. At the age of 9, she concluded this in relation to the 4 texts that she had read. If you do the little things, then you might grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, like Wangari's did. And then it might become a global impact. Her love for nature and the environment and her helping nature, it got bigger and bigger until it was a movement. And then it hit the world. Well, if you start small, it could become big. Your impact, what you do, it could become global. Then if you carry on going and stick with it, then everyone could realize that. And then there could be a law in every country that you should respect nature. This is why I felt this research was so important, because particularly within literary circles, and I appreciate I'm talking to you as a social scientist rather than what you may perceive natural scientist, a lot of people within the realms of literary analyses, they actually analyze the literature, but they don't talk about who's actually reading it. And I felt that was fundamentally important in terms of what we were researching in this particular doctrine. So in essence, the selected text provided a green framing of the young reader's expectations, which in turn generated perceptions of a distinctive green lens, the way in which each example of children's literature shaped and guided expectations, and also their affiliation with the environmentalist messages therein. By experiencing the otherness of protagonists that can be defined by their gender, ethnicity, culture, or anthropomorphization, the selected text provide an array of contrasting and comparable opportunities to identify with environmentalist attitudes beyond their own personal experiences. So they essentially were able to vicariously experience those environmental issues through the protagonists that they were reading about. While the participants' responses highlighted a focus on individual environmentalist acts and behavioral changes, there was to a certain degree implying an acute ability to make deeper connections to environmental degradation and systemic social practices. So we're not just looking, the students, the children, were actually able not only to engage in those individual environmentalist acts, but also to look at the bigger picture. And we should give credit to children of multiple ages within Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, between the ages of 5 and 11, they get it, they understand it. And the whole point of this research was to give the opportunity to those students to have a platform so their voice could be heard. Now, what are the implications of this? That research actually led on to the creation of a program of study. And Shrewsbury House School, current employers, they gave me the opportunity to create a 10-week program of study in which we actually used children's literature as a literary window into the climate crisis and the wider world. And that was actually part of my qualification at University College London, so collaborating with those. And the literary window I chose for this particular program of study was Lost Words. Lost Words, a spell book by Robert McFarlane, has become a huge bestseller, and it is now actually considered one of Britain's favorite books of all time on the natural world. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the text, it's Robert McFarlane, I'm sure you're aware of for many of his other titles, but this particular text is rather poignant. I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question now. What do the words conker, heather, kingfisher, bramble have in common? They've all actually been lost from children's dictionaries. I'll let that sink in. There are literally words that are being lost from the vocabulary of children because these words are being replaced by Wi-Fi and YOLO, whatever it may be. Fact of the matter is this. This book is a collection of acrostic poems based on each of those words so that children find those words. And my program of study, which I designed with Shrewsbury House School and UCL, and allowed us the opportunity to explore and find those words. So over the course of the 10 weeks, we started with conducting literary analyses of these poems, calling on my pedagogical expertise as head of English. But then what we did was we actually went to find some of those words. And we're in collaboration with the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. We actually took those students to the Wetlands Centre in Barnes, and they actually chose their own lost word to then write their own acrostic poems based on those particular species. Wonderful poems concerning gadwall and smew and newts and the like. Then what they did was, after looking at the life of Sir Peter Scott, aforementioned, and the world of conservation and how the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust plays its part in that, the students then looked at the works of Carl Linnaeus and looked at his classification systems and how they've been used within the realms of conservation before then actually going and having been given photos and descriptions of various forms of wildfowl, they actually then created their own classification system and compared that with the system created by Carl Linnaeus. What did we do then? In collaboration with the Linnaean Society of London, those students then presented not only their poems, but also their research on classification and conservation in the same building that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was presented all those years ago. This is the potential of environmental education. This is the potential of children's literature providing a literary window into the wider world and the climate crisis that is very much at the forefront of our minds. Now, I've then taken this program of study and within the realms of the IUCN and the Commission for Education and Communication, what I've done is we're working towards something bigger, something bold. And what we would like to do, and what we're in the process of discussing and creating, is a digital online platform. A digital online platform whereby teachers, such as myself, can go online and they can identify and choose from a selection of children's literature that could provide a literary window into the climate crisis and the environmental issues that have come to permeate the wider world. That literary window can then be utilized to open up a world of all of those IUCN member organizations, the 1,500 member organizations that all have their own environmental education programs of study, their own resources, and their own nature-based knowledge and expertise. And the idea was with that AI-led digital platform, teachers and students will be able to access programs of study such as the one that I've created, using artificial intelligence, and ensuring that any learning that takes place in the classroom is informed by scientists such as yourself. It's informed by data-driven, science-based knowledge and understanding that's live, current, and then can then inform the decision makers of the future. To engage with a literary analogy, I'm a great fan of Paradise Lost. And unfortunately, we're in the process of losing paradise. We're looking over the abyss right now. And in the process, we're trying to create through the IUCN, Linnaean Society, and my works with both University of Cambridge and Shrewsbury House School, we're writing a poem akin to the one that's been written by Robert McFarlane. We're writing an epic poem that is going to encourage and fight the climate crisis through the realm of environmental education. And I ask you, in the writing of this poem, you, as fellows of the Zoological Society of London, have an opportunity to write a verse that's part of that poem. What will that verse be? Thank you very much.
Okay, amazing stuff. Thank you so much. Really impactful work looking into how we can encourage, support, and listen to our next generation of conservationists. So straight on to talk number 2 is from conservation to restoration. What impact will the EU's proposed nature restoration regulation have within EU, UK, and beyond? From Dr. Martin Steinfeld from the University of Cambridge.
Hello, everybody. I'm very loud, so I don't normally even need a microphone. I can usually broadcast very, very fast. So let's see how this goes. I'm Dr. Martin Steinfeld at the University of Cambridge. I am also, where's the thing gone? I'm also soon to be, what do I need to push to get? Oh dear. Sorry. My first slide. I'm also soon to be associate college professor at Hughes Hall within the University of Cambridge. And the reason that I mention that, so I'm both a social scientist and a lawyer, and the reason that I mention that is that my college is unique within the University of Cambridge. I'm biased, and one of the reasons is because we are one of only 3 mature colleges at the University of Cambridge, but another of which is that we are really the hotspot when it comes to environmental law and climate change engagement more generally. So we currently house, I don't have one of those buttons, the Centre for Climate Engagement in Hughes Hall, with whom I've been very grateful for support. But also we currently house the university's first Professor of Climate Change Law, Professor Harry van Asselt, and my other colleagues to whom I'm very grateful for helping me with this today, Dr. Marcus Gehring, who's the university's leading environmental law lawyer. And collectively, there's a lot of environmental law things going on, despite the fact that my background mostly relates to free movement and EU citizenship law, for which I published a recent book. That was actually the book cover. I am very, very grateful to ZSL for doing this today, and I'm sure we all are, and I'd love this to continue in future years. What I'm going to present today is on the EU's proposed nature restoration regulation, which is radical if it becomes law, and the implications that it might have within the UK and beyond. I'm going to go through a little bit the pre-existing legislative framework, then some of the specifics. I'll try and do it in a non-lawyer speak as much as I can. Most importantly, some of the criticisms, and then what might actually happen to this regulation and what might its impact actually be. I will be as quick as I can in the 10 minutes. So the first point to make is that this is the biggest legislative change that the EU is proposing since the 1992 Habitats Directive. I'm going to put my program down here. It's influenced by the 2022 IPCC report, but also I noted the convention, the 2022 Convention on the Future of Europe, which I've just published a journal article on. And it's interesting to note that the priority of a bottom-up citizenships project, what EU citizens really, really wanted was to be a so-called environment and climate leader. And that was prioritized above and beyond many other concerns, for instance, things such as trade, that you would expect that the Citizens' Conference within the European Union might be more interested in, even democracy. So this was something that was high on the agenda. In addition, the background to this is supposed to be implementing the European Green Deal and the EU's biodiversity strategy. The latter refers to there being a need for a quote unquote ambitious EU restoration plan. So this is the flag mark of that policy. As I said, it is supposed to be to complement but not replace the Birds Directive, as well as the Habitats Directive, the Water Framework Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and Invasive Species Regulation. But the Commission is of the view, this is why we're having this regulation, that there are lacunas in all of this, that the member states don't really have any binding targets or timelines, and there's no real comprehensive mapping in the current legislation. So there's a need for change, and it's a pretty radical change in many ways. The change. Well, I'm not going to go through every article of the proposed regulation, particularly since I suspect most of you aren't lawyers and I don't want to bore you all to tears. But essentially, you're talking about at least 20 of the union's land and sea areas having to, 20% of the union's land and sea areas having to be restored under the Article 1 of the proposed regulation. And there is reference to this needing to be done without delay and needing to be effective. Then the nuts and bolts of this, what's going to be restored? Well, water ecosystems under Article 4, marine ecosystems, urban ecosystems under Articles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 in tandem, and ending up with forest ecosystems in Article 10. And there are targets that have been set for member states in all of these areas outlined in Articles 8 to 10. How is this to be achieved? Well, one version of looking at this simply is to look simply at the proposed Articles 4, 1, and 2. Every member state has to come up with a national restoration plan. And that restoration plan, if it relates to habitats that are not in good condition, requires that 30% of them need to be restored by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 90% by 2050. I know that is pretty radical, particularly given what has been going on in Scotland in the last few days. Article 4, subsection 2, refers to habitats that need to be established in the first place. And by the way, you could say wow again, because that wow is 100% by 2050. Well, I got a cob on for that one. Wow. Chapter 3, crucially, outlines what member states must do. They have to create a plan. And each member state has to go into very specific detail as to how they're going to do it in Articles 12, 13, and 14. They have to write a draft. It has to be submitted and scrutinized and assessed by the Commission itself. It's noticeable also that in Article 16, there needs to be the ability for people to challenge it. So equivalence in, dare I say it, zoological societies within the European Union, you should be able to challenge if your member state is not sticking to what they say they would do. And under Chapter 4 of the proposed regulation, the member states must continue to monitor their own performance and report to the Commission. From a zoological point of view, I don't have that much time. The devil is always in the detail. This is contained in the annexes. So what are they supposed to be restoring? Well, things such as wetlands. There's several groups in Annexes 1 and 2. One relates essentially to land. Annex 2 relates to sea and water. So Group 1 is wetlands, things like inland salt meadows. Group 2 deals with the sea, seagrass beds, shellfish beds, etc. These are the places that need to be earmarked for restoration. So what's the potential? Well, there's a lot. The Commission itself in explanatory memorandums made this clear that they want to contribute to the continuous long-term and sustained recovery of biodiverse and resilient nature on the EU's land and sea areas in circumstances where there is a degradation of ecosystems at an alarming rate, harming people, the economy, and the climate. And you can see these are the various things that are intended to be achieved by this proposed regulation. Then there is the big question, gaps. Well, the WWF in tandem with BirdLife International, Client Earth, and the EEB have all looked at gaps, and then will it become law? That's the big question. And I'm sure some of you have probably worked out something's been going on recently in relation to this. In relation to the WWF report first, fairer contributions by each member state. The targets, some members, essentially the member states themselves are allowed to determine what is subject under Article 1 in the first place. The targets are too low, and the marine restoration targets in particular are unimplementable, quote unquote, because they have to actually be passed via the common fisheries policy at the same time. The big issue now is essentially it's been blocked at council level by all the various member states, some abstaining, some against it. The WWF responded to this with quote unquote incredulity and sees this as a betrayal. Finally, the impact in the UK and beyond. Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this isn't technically covered under the pre-existing trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU. However, as a question of practice, would the UK ignore this? And the answer to that, in my view, is for lots of reasons, no. And in particular, because if it is the case that there is a proposal for instance, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, to more closely align the UK with the EU, this is exactly the kind of regulation that the UK might want to implement at the same time and probably will be. I'm going to end with a quote from Joel Relland from the UK and a Changing Europe, who wrote this very recently. In reality, regulation is being used to impose the EU's values onto the rest of the world. Compliance with the EU's product standards, in particular, amongst other things, usually means compliance with the EU standards, amongst other things, environmental rights. Malaysia, for instance, and Indonesia objected to the EU's attempt at preventing deforestation. The US tried to oppose the carbon border adjustment mechanism for carbon tariffs. In other words, the EU has historically had a very important role, particularly in trade agreements that it signs with third countries, in exporting norms to countries all around the world. They insert these things into trade agreements. So when I lectured on the external relations course at the University of Cambridge, one of those would be the ACP agreement and the Cotonou agreement between ACP countries and the EU. But even within the UK, as Raylan put it, despite the UK technically being free of Brussels red tape, as he put it, because the EU remains UK's chief export market, EU regulations become de facto UK ones. So if this becomes law within the European Union, there's a very, very good chance that it will be coming here. And dare I say it, that ZSL will be playing a pretty important role in ensuring adherence by the UK government to this. Thank you for your time. And I think I did it 2 times.
Okay, fantastic. How uplifting to hear that there are proposed policies that align with what we do here. Really nice. So on to talk 3, we have got a new offering in sustainability consulting, Acting for Nature by Bethany Greenman from Oakdean Commons.
Hello. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you to the ZSL for putting on this event. I think it's a really important and fantastic opportunity for all of us. So what am I going to be talking about? A new offering in sustainability consulting, Acting for Nature. So what this is really about is translating all this fantastic work that we've been talking about today into business. What does it mean for companies, their product lines, their values, their business models? How do we persuade them to implement all these changes for nature? I'm going to be introducing this through a case study of a company that I've been working with, Silent Night. So firstly, who am I? So I'm Bethany Freeman, as introduced. I'm a sustainability consultant at Oakdean Collins. I've been working there for over 2 years now. I have a undergrad BSc in biology from the University of Portsmouth and recently completed a master's degree in environmental management at the University of Hertfordshire that I was studying part-time. And this is a lovely photo of me at Whipsnade Zoo on a volunteering day I had to help prepare some food for the giraffes in the summer. So Oakdean Collins, that's a company I currently work for. They are a sustainability and circular economy consultancy. We do work in carbon footprinting, material flow analysis, and sustainability strategies for businesses, amongst a lot of other things. Silent Night Group, one of our fantastic clients who have agreed to let me talk about some work that we've been doing with them today. They are a leading mattress manufacturer in the UK, among other products that they have. And they really have a clear sustainability strategy in mind. They're very leading in this area in their sector. So what is the journey that we've had with Silent Night Group? So Oakley & Hollands first started working with Silent Night Group in 2017. We helped them prepare some initial sustainability work to help them win an award in sustainability for their industry. We helped develop then their sustainability strategy, aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals. This then led into doing some carbon accounting work, scope 1 to 3 analysis, and doing some product LCAs for them. This was then pivotal in them winning a contract with Premier Inn, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Next, we then started work aligning everything with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, and continue working on their plans in their sustainability strategy and continually doing that carbon reporting. So they were then looking about what's next. How can we develop this further? And that's where I came in and with my passion in nature, proposed a new approach to looking at carbon accounting as acting for nature. So really tying in carbon footprinting and nature, because, you know, nature can be so important to us. Thinking about peatlands, for example, they're a lovely ecosystem. They store so much carbon. There's things like nature-based solutions and things as well. Well, Silent Night, they love the idea of tying in nature. And so we started this work with them. So what do we define as acting for nature? Well, acting for nature is a comprehensive approach to addressing the various environmental challenges facing our planet's natural spaces to foster a balanced and a harmonious relationship between a company and the natural world. It entails deliberate and meaningful commitment to action to protecting, preserving, and promoting the well-being of the natural world, including ecosystems, biodiversity, and the overall environment, across sites, products, and the value chain of a business. So, getting started, what have we done with them on this work program? Well, firstly, problem definition. So, looking at defining what acting for nature really means, what it meant to them. Next was a lot of desk-based research, backing up why we were doing this, looking at Silent Night, any information they had already, any work they were already doing. Then it was more onto the actual assessments. So we started to do some materials assessments through SBTN, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Nature. Yeah, just getting my 5-minute warning. So yeah, we started to do some assessments there, really diving into their products and materials that they were using. We then used this to develop some training materials, and I've got a little example there of our handbook that I've developed with them, which gives an introduction to why they're doing this, why it's important, what the regulations are that might impact them, and that those assessments that we've done on materials and their value chain, and then some actions of how they can get started. And we're now into the next phase of using that handbook to really plan and pilot some initiatives. So what does this mean for other companies? Well, I think it's pivotal. I think it's going to be so important for other companies. Unsustainable actions, as we already know, are leading to negative impacts to the environment. But we're crucially now making that link to businesses. We've got ecosystem services, ecosystem collapse, and they're going to impact business operations. And I think really translating that to companies, to a business, is so important. And they're beginning to recognize this. So how can we help businesses? How can we get started? So I'm going to go through now, I think hopefully this is quite good timing, 3 in 3. 3 tips in 3 minutes of how we can help businesses. Firstly, putting yourself in a company director's shoes. A company director wants to make profits. They want the success of their business. They want to make real impact with their products. You've got to talk their language. Talk about corporate sustainable responsibility, corporate social responsibility, sorry. Regulations and legislation that's relative to them and nature. Business risks and customer customer demands. What does a customer want? Really talk their language and put nature into that. Next, stay informed on the latest policies and developments, such as coming to events like this. LinkedIn as well, I love LinkedIn. Spend 10 minutes on LinkedIn, commit yourself to doing that, to looking at what's going on, what's the latest news and developments. Talk about it with companies and clients. And next, familiarize yourself with nature impact tools. I put the lovely ZSL Spot tool there, but you know, ones like I've talked about today, the SBTN tool. Maybe have a play around, choose a random company and see how it might fit in with that. There's so many tools out there other than these as well. You know, there's the DEFRA Magic Maps tool, I love that. There's the MBN Atlas, which shows biodiversity surveys. There's so many different tools out there. So familiarize yourself with these. So yeah, all in all, companies really are seeing the need for change here and seeing the need for acting for nature. And consultants and all of us are going to be pivotal in helping them to do so. So thank you for listening. I encourage you to connect with me. I've got a little QR code up there. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to come find me. Thank you very much.
Okay, another fantastic talk, and acting for nature is exactly what we want to see businesses doing. So that is wonderful stuff. So on to talk number 4, we've got hybridization in endangered wildlife populations with Ray Heaton, trustee at WaderQuest.
Okay, thank you to the organizers and thank you all for coming. I thought you might like to see a few pictures of animals. So straight into the first slide. Now, this is one of many topics I'd love to talk to you about, and maybe I'll live long enough to attend another one of these conferences and come back. Hybridization is when two species, two subspecies, or possibly two discrete populations of animals come together. Nothing wrong with that, happens in the time of the natural world, although there are huge debates about how much it contributes to evolution. Actually, you wouldn't think so, but there are. So I just wanted to go through a few things. I'll make some points with the orang, spend a bit of time, and then I'm going to race through a lot of other things. And I hope I get to the end before I get to the end. So these are male orangs, Bornean and Sumatran. In about the 60s and 70s, when I was still a young lad, I suppose, about 60% of the zoo population was hybridized. People didn't know the difference. You had these phenomenal conversations about wet rust and dry, you know, and people didn't know. The zoo in I think it was Perth, had one type of orang, but thought they had another. So once DNA testing came along, zoos embraced it, they got going, and they separated these animals wonderfully. And now there are still about 100 hybrid animals in the zoo, world zoos around, but they're not bred from, and they never have been for a long time. So here we've got the females, and there's Bornean and Sumatran. And the problem was, once they'd sorted out the two species, the two geographical species from totally different islands in the captive population, 3 subspecies of Bornean orang were announced. And if you could get pictures of those 3 distinct ones, I'd love to have them. But they were announced, and that was a bit of a problem. And the zoo population is still working on a mixture of those 3 subspecies. And I think that's an area that we should look at sorting out. And in the meantime, about 1984 something, another species of orang appeared, and I didn't start my stopwatch, so I don't know where I am, never mind. Another species of orang appeared, and this is the Tapanuli from Sumatra, and this is more closely related to the Bornean. So before Ice Age inundation, they were presumably linked in some way. There are probably a very few of these in captivity, and they could have hybridized, but it's still something that needs to be sorted out. So this problem is when you've got a small number of animals as the founder population, such as in the extinct from the wild animals, you really have to look at the genetics of the founders. In some cases, it's all you've got, so you have to put up with it. Anyway, a couple of different points on conserving evolutionary processes. Now in Sabah, one of the subspecies of Bornean orang, the pygmaea, lives on either side of a big river, the Katabatangan. and they've not crossed traditionally. So these small populations of orang in the riparian forest, north and south of the big river, are looked after separately. So you get a very few animals here and a few there, but they're joined up. So future evolutionary processes could possibly carry on. If those two populations, either of them, became very, very small, and there was no way they could sustain themselves into the future, then you might mix the populations up. But there's another scenario further south in Saba where there is a small river which was connected across two national parks by giant trees, which have now been felled. And the two populations became isolated in this section, same subspecies. So the decision was taken to put in rope bridges, and now the two populations are connected. Right, I've no idea what time it is because I didn't do my stopwatch, but never mind. So now let's look at another primate example. This is the black and white ruffed lemur and the red ruffed lemur. And for a long time, captive groups used to keep these as one species, because in Madagascar, the red ruffed lemur was up here, but all these little dots were probably joined together by rainforest, not anymore. And there are two subspecies of the black and white ruffed lemur down here somewhere that I don't think anyone's working with. In captivity, we have the nominate type, and then at the top here was the red ruffed lemur. And they discovered they'd been separated for a long time. But in the meantime, zoo populations produced these delightful animals. Some of them were big and fluffy, looked great, but these are hybrids. And so they were retired from breeding, and then pure stocks were brought in to avoid this idea that we've got hybrid animals. Because should we want to release red ruffed lemurs back into northern Madagascar, it would be good to have the right genes that have evolved in that environment that could go back in there and succeed. Right, we're back in 1925. We've already been there once this morning. This is an Atlas lion from a Casablanca airline flight that I sadly wasn't on. And that was the last one I ever seen, except that these animals still exist in captivity. Howlets have got them, Port Lim. And a lot of people say, oh, they're just hybrid lions, but they were kept in the King's Menagerie in Rabat Zoo for a very long time. And they may be partially hybrid, but this is all we've got left of the North African fantastic subspecies. That's a much bigger story to this, actually, but let's move on. Florida cougar is an example of genetic rescue. This particular animal in the Everglades, very tiny population left, and they were showing genetic abnormalities and that sort of thing. So they got some similar closely related subspecies of puma, cougar, whatever you want to call it, mountain lion, from Texas and bred, and the success is evident in that photograph. European bison. I'm jumping about a bit, I hope you don't mind. The zoo population is mainly the European forest bison, but one single animal, Caucasus, from the Caucasus was brought by Hagenbeck back to Europe, and his genes are still in the population. And this is the plains bison of Europe. In North America, the plains bison survives in numbers now. It all went down to tiny numbers. But the wood bison is actually quite rare in North America. It's the other way around in Europe at the moment. This one, unfortunately, didn't contribute to the gene pool as it had been shot, like so many of them were, sadly. We still know where the genes are from this animal in the International Stud Book. And if we could ever put plain bison back, it would be nice to have probably that mixing, even though we've got this dreadful word again, hybridization. Okay, two African wild asses. No one seems to know about the Somali wild ass. This is the Somali wild ass that's common in zoos. Relatively speaking, it's a very attractive animal. The Nubian wild ass, which may still survive in the wild, is almost unknown. And they hybridize very easily with domestic donkeys and all that sort of thing. But this picture is taken in Bonaire in the Caribbean, where all the donkeys are mostly feral, and they all fit the genotype of the Nubian wild ass. And they could well be exactly that. Somehow they got taken out to the Caribbean. Someone should be looking at that. You know, that's a zoo animal of an important equid that we could be promoting. ZSL are working with the Vietnamese pheasant. Originally, oh, sorry, I knew this was going to be a problem. The Edwards pheasant is the original bird that everybody wanted.
a few years back in the 60s, we had this one at the zoo. This is a hybrid between the silver pheasant, which is a bit more common in the forest, and the Edwards, called the imperial pheasant. And then suddenly another one was discovered with white-tailed feathers, and they call this the Vietnamese pheasant. Now, what happened here is that these are all the same animal, and the population of the wild was so tiny in the Vietnamese rainforest. That's why we got this hybrid here with the silver pheasant. But this one is an inbred population, and some of the ex situ, some of the zoo populations of the pheasant were so inbred that this white tail occurred in them. And it was then discovered from quite sophisticated DNA testing that they were the same animal. So they're now kept together, bred together. They're being reintroduced into Vietnam where they're probably all extinct in the forest. And this is called the Vietnamese form. And this one is called the Edwards form, but we call it Vietnamese pheasant so that Vietnam will adopt it and embrace it as a species. Very quickly, this is a flightless grebe, a lake in Costa Rica. This is a flighted grebe. These ones flew into the lake, bred with them, and on one of the surveys, the flightless grebes flew away. Extinct. Yeah. It's not a great joke, is it, really? Okay, I've got 3 slides left. Galapagos Islands. They're putting back partial hybrids because after 100 years of there being no tortoises on Floriana where Darwin went, they were rediscovered up here in a bay. They'd been liberated from ships and they were mixing with the Beckii tortoises that we have in the zoo. Also, St. George's line was discovered here as hybrids. And a lot of these tortoises with the raised shell, with the saddleback, have become very, very rare. There are like 14 species just in the Galapagos. You go there, spend the rest of the time with tortoise species. Extraordinary. They now have quite a lot of the species to go back into Floriana. All right. In the Seychelles, there are 2 morphotypes discovered, which are not the same as the Aldabra tortoise, but they don't show much genetic distance. And there's a grazing one and a browsing one. And browsing animals are needed in Indian Ocean Island restoration in order to help vegetation recover. Places like Round Island. And this is the only candidate as a native animal. And it's very, very rare. Credits. Chinese giant salamander working in the zoo, 5 or 6 species. Pharmaceuticals and probably for food and so on. English bullfrog survived as one male before people realized we actually had a bullfrog species since the Ice Age. And then the northern bullfrogs were brought in quite rightly. But in the meantime, this chap had been bred with southern bullfrog. And there is a couple of populations in the wild where his genes still survive. What we're going to do with that, I don't know. Last of all, widespread species can be mixed up unintentionally. The emerald tree boa and the green tree python, very widespread species. Mark Chan tells me that you can identify all the different types, but they get mixed up in captivity because people like to keep them in very attractive snakes. And there we go, hybridization will become a problem. Maybe that's something one ought to look at. And thank you to all these guys who helped me with pictures and so on.
Well, regardless of the stopwatch, I think we can all agree that yes, we did want to see pictures of animals. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And such a complex and interesting part of conservation, the topic of hybridization. So on to talk number 5, we have got researching the history and current distribution of the Eurasian golden jackal in mainland Europe with Professor Keith Somerville from the University of London. There we go.
I've got a mixture of affiliations, but first I'd like to say thank you to the organizers. This is fantastic and long may it continue. And thank you, I don't know, Emma, are you in here? No. I wanted to say a big thank you and to sort of big up the ZSL Library and its services to researchers. particularly Emma and her fellow librarians who, through the research for 3 or 4 of my books, have been invaluable with their help, and it's always such a nice, friendly place to come and do work. So I'm deeply grateful to ZSL and to them for providing that. I'm a hybrid. I'm very much a hybrid. I started out as a political scientist, became a journalist, particularly covering Africa for the BBC World Service, during which I was able somehow to persuade my bosses to pay for me to go to Botswana for a month to do programs on Botswana's conservation policies. This was back in the early 1990s, and on the whole issue of elephants and the ivory trade. I stayed with the BBC and continued to manage to tie a lever into things that I did, work about wildlife and conservation. I left the BBC and became an academic. And while I was basically teaching and writing about journalism and propaganda and things like that, I kept my African side, and I've written 5 books on various aspects of African politics. And through that, through a narrative that proved to be an absolute lie about ivory poaching, funding Al-Shabaab in Somalia, I got into looking at the illegal wildlife trade and then human-wildlife conflict, and followed up writing a book on the ivory trade with the encouragement of David MacDonald and Amy Dickman at Wild Crew in Oxford, writing a book on humans and lions, following all the publicity about the killing of Cecil the lion. Moved on to one of my favorite animals, cats, because journalists are often compared with them, hyenas, do like a political economy of human hyenas. Then we've got jackals, golden wolves, which used to be called jackals, and my spirit animal, the honey badger. If you'd ever seen me on the rugby field, small, stocky, not taking a step backwards. And I have just finished writing a book on African rhinos. And again, like a history and political economy of African rhinos. And I've moved on, taking stuff from the jackal book to this. This fine animal. You have possibly the best known top rope. Jackal, fascinating. Very, you could say, altruistic social structure. Adults tend to mate for life. They produce large litters of cubs. And instead of all the cubs dispersing every year, some of them will stay with the adults to bring up the next generation of cubs. And it's not cubs, pups. It's not purely altruistic, because it's been proven with the blackback jackal that those jackals that stay on to help the parents then have better breeding success and better survival of their young. So interesting animals. Now, originally, along the coast of Croatia and Albania, and around the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria, and then across Turkey, the Middle East, and Asia, as far as Vietnam, with a variety of different species. They have begun to spread. Number of questions as to why they have spread, and they have now spread that every mainland country in Europe, with the exception of Portugal, has sightings, verified sightings, roadkill, sadly a lot get killed on the roads, that prove the presence of European jackal. No, we've now gone, I've jumped ahead. One of the big questions, as I say, is why are they dispersing? They were in these other areas and were there in Bulgaria. Records are from the 14th century, from siege of the capital, Sofia, where the besieging Ottoman army had seen jackals, possibly on the battlefields, scavenging the dead. Jackals are omnivores. They are very, very good at varying their diet. They have a very, very plastic diet. Unfortunately, in some areas, their scats, their droppings, have been found to have plastic in them because they will forage on human waste sites. But across the different areas where they occur, they will live on things like roe deer. They can kill roe deer fawns, might possibly with a couple working together, kill a sick or injured adult. They will prey on hares, rodents, ground nesting birds, insects. They eat a surprising amount of fruit. They also, in a lot of areas, scavenge livestock. They rarely, there are very, very few proven cases across Europe of them killing livestock, but they will scavenge from carcasses, particularly poultry. In the occupied Golan Heights between Israel and Syria, there are a large number of large-scale poultry farms, and they are not very meticulous about disposing of the remains. And there are large numbers of jackals there who particularly scavenge the remains from the poultry farms, but also cattle farms, with very few recorded instances of attacks on cattle. They wait for the carcasses. And you could say they provide ecosystem services. So they are very adaptable in terms of their diet, which means they have possibilities to disperse. Why have they suddenly dispersed? They were stuck in these areas around the up until maybe the last 50 years. What has changed in those years? There are a number of possibilities. One that is often put up, which I am rather skeptical, is that the disappearance, the killing of wolves across areas of Europe meant there was a space, and the belief that wolves would keep out jackals. They would kill them or just deter them from being in the area. To me, that doesn't fit. African black-backed jackals, species, we could all kill them, but they coexist, and they find ways of avoiding while still, say, scavenging from targets. So I'm not convinced by that. And one reason that they could be in slightly different areas without wolves actually deterring jackals is the terrain. Wolves will go more for forest and for slightly mountainous areas. Jackals like agricultural areas where wolves will be persecuted, and wetlands and grassland and bush. Another reason, climate change. Jackals are not good at hunting in thick, deep snow. So where there is strong, long-lasting snow cover, they have been deterred from moving in. Now that snow cover is less deep, is less long-lasting, they have moved. They are up in all the Baltic states, Finland, and even up into one has been seen in the Arctic Circle of Norway. And then, as I say, across the rest of Europe. Human farming and land use have changed. The more waste there is, the more jackals have got to forage on. And so they are spreading. If we didn't have the sea, if we still had Doggerland, that used to be called the link between Europe and Britain, we would have jackals coming over here. One thing that is needed, and chiming in with what Martin was saying about EU regulations, there aren't common regulations among EU states about jackals. So that's my jackal thing. Very quickly, the other area I continue to look at, my book on humans and African rights comes out here. And then serve, and then it's all match up between exploitation and conservation of rights. Serve. So one that is not popular with many people. But Africa I've got no time. Do it through community. Don't do it through militarization, through harassing local people. Pretty successful to get the community something, which I think is probably what. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. How amazing to hear all about the existence of an animal that I'm sure quite a lot of people aren't even aware of. So we are on to our final talk now, A Caribbean Killer by Dr. Brian Wilson from the University of Oxford.
Right, so I've got a minute left, which straight to the acknowledgements, I guess, yeah? Okay, so we've heard a huge number of talks from the terrestrial environment. I'm here to represent from the marine side. The terrestrial environment is massively overrepresented in conservation efforts. That should say a Caribbean killer. Looks like the PowerPoint transformation isn't quite right there, Lindsay. But that's fine. I wrote this in code, and it was too much for the ZSL presentation. So that should say a Caribbean killer. But I'm usually here in my primary role is in my ongoing quest to save the world's rarest coral, the Chagas brain coral, from extinction, which is something I'm actively involved with colleagues here at London Zoo and also at the Horniman Museum and Gardens. But we have one of my wonderful expedition colleagues, Colette, giving the engagement session on the Chagas brain coral expedition I led last year, and I absolutely suggest you go and see that because it was something of a chaos, to say the least. This is a little offshoot that I have. This is some work I do in the Caribbean, in the eastern side of the Caribbean, in the Virgin Islands, in fact, and in particular in St. John, which is, in my opinion, the most beautiful of the Virgin Islands. And it's down in this southeast tip here of St. John, which is a US national park and a US monument as well. It's the highest level of conservation status. I was working out of the Virgin Islands Environmental Research Station, which I have been for about the last 10 years. And this is how it used to look classically before Hurricanes Irma and Maria ripped through in 2017 and left the place a bomb site. It was a wonderful meeting place of international researchers from all over the world. And there was always a Bohemian playing a flamenco guitar at some point in the gazebo under the trees there. But this no longer looks like this. It's a bomb site with rats the size of dogs, I think, running through the ruins, or dogs the size of rats. I forget which one it is. This is how it looks from above. The hill station is here, and there's having a little history here. This was back in the 60s, a top secret US military base hidden beneath the tree canopy there, looking into developing ways of beating the USSR to the moon in the space race of the 60s. And whilst I do much of my work in Little Lamb and Great Lamb Bay here, a lot of my dives are in Tektite here, And so Tektite was actually the site where NASA and the US military sunk an underwater habitat at 15 meters to train their astronauts to survive the effects of isolation and study their psychology when they were going into space. More importantly for me, though, it was one of the seminal women in STEM movements led by the incredible Sylvia Earle here, which saw her take a team of fabulous leaders now in science down to this habitat and stay there and survey those reefs around that habitat for a month or so. I was invited out there by this wonderful colleague of mine, Pete Edmonds, one of the top coral biologists in the world. He used to take me, well, he takes everyone that joins him on these trips out to this rock here, which you might be able to see over his shoulder, which I'll tone it down for this is usually a talk I give on evening audiences, but he calls it the Flock U Rock. And if you look at the obscene gesture it's pointing, he says that if you don't respect the oceans, it will flock you up. And there's usually a band of terrified undergraduates moving to the edge as far away as they can on that little metal boat of his to get away from it. He's a terrifying man, but unlike the son he never wanted, which is beautiful. He's the father I never had, to be fair. So yeah, I met him actually through networking, which is yeah, I'd got to the end of a terribly jet-lagged flight over to Taiwan, and I was I think slightly hungover and woke up on his lap and didn't realize he was chairing the session that I was giving a talk in. But it must have gone down well because despite this, or because of this, he then invited me out to his base in California, where he took me to the restaurant that Justin Bieber was kicked out of the night before for rowdy behavior. So that was a beautiful start to our collaboration. I'm not a fan of Justin Bieber, so that was a make or break for me, to be fair. And I'm essentially what I'm looking at here in collaboration with Pete, who's had one of the, well, actually the longest ongoing study of a reef site in the world. So it's going on 40 years now, where he returns to the same site to look at the impacts of climate change on Caribbean reefs, which are being hit harder than anywhere else in the world, to be fair. And what I was looking at in particular was the chemistry of attraction. And this is the attraction of coral larvae to the seafloor. For those that you don't know, a very quick lesson in coral biology, corals tend to, there's two types of breeding. One is broadcast spawning, where eggs and sperm are released from different gendered corals into the ocean above, and they fertilize in the seawater and form these planula, these larvae. Or you have brooders, which actually they fertilize within the coral, hermaphrodites, and release fully formed larvae. These larvae tend to, they're positively buoyant, they float to the surface because they're packed full of lipids that act as a kind of an energy store. And then they swim around for a week or two to look for a perfect place to settle. Now, that's very important for a coral because historically, before climate change took its pernicious hold on the planet, corals could live for centuries or more. And so it was very important that a coral find a really good place to sit. The theory was essentially that they'd swim around, and then when they came to a place, they'd become negatively phototactic. They'd swim away from the light. I often used to discuss that in terms of goths that hang around in supermarkets that you usually see under the underhangs. Again, negatively phototactic. But there's another theory that suggests that across those coralline algae, which are like lichens that are on the seafloor, these wonderful pinks and purples you see, in collaboration with the bacteria on this surface, create these pheromones that basically beckon these baby corals down to the seafloor. And so this was something I really wanted to kind of deconstruct and pull out and see what it was, what kind of effect it was having, driving recruitment and settlement of corals in the Caribbean region, which is suffering such losses of Caribbean reefs at the moment. So I headed out with my trusty and now crusty, admittedly, I really should clean it down, photo quadrat into the Caribbean Sea to essentially sample various of these lichens from the seafloor to see if we could kind of unpin this relationship. A lot of health and safety issues that nobody warned me about. This one in particular, Bert the barracuda, who hangs out under the jetty, about 20 years old, 3 meters long, and as you backed off the jetty into the water, he would drop down eerily and eyeball you and then go back up again. I didn't think he'd attacked anyone, but then we had a master's student who was in love, which is a beautiful thing. And she had a promise ring, which I didn't even know what that was until I met her. And it's a kind of a pre-engagement ring, I think. And she was cleaning down our boats and defouling it. And we said to her, listen, you should probably take off any jewelry while you're doing that. She said, but it's a promise ring, I'm in love. And we went, I mean, that's sweet, but... And she ignored us, and about 15 minutes later, there was a scream from the jetty, and she came running towards us, white as a sheet, with a partially severed finger, with her promise ring hanging off, and Bert had come out attracted by the flash and taken her hand. Of course, it was hard for us not to laugh. It wasn't that hard for me, to be fair. I laughed openly. But yeah, so Bert was a big issue. Oh, that was for the evening talk. I don't know how I got in there, to be fair. I really should have looked at the presentation before. This is the biggest one for me, fire corals. My God, they're like a double stinging nettle, really bad, but it's a rite of passage. And so I have a student I'm bringing out with me in this summer, and at some point she'll be maneuvered comedically onto a fire coral, because it is a rite of passage for anyone diving in the oceans. I'll have to check the risk assessment first and what the University of Oxford says about that. Of course, you know, they do come out in these beautiful scenes, and that's actually me there chatting to Dan, our boatsman. What you can't see is the hurling of obscenities, because I've just been stung by a fire coral, and I'm desperate to get my wetsuit off. Not with Dan, admittedly, but and put some salve on those wounds. What I did is I looked at the microbiomes and these various different crustose coralline algae, these lichens on the seafloor, and straight away saw this clustering that was very different from everything else. And it turns out this is this golden crust that you see forming over the reefs here. And Pete, who'd been looking at these reefs for about 40 years now, had noticed anecdotally in his surveys that it was showing up more and more in his surveys. So it's actually we think a collection of a number of different red algae, so Peysonelia, Ramacrusta, and Lobophora. And it forms these kind of functional consortia that come together to form this crust that's basically taking over the reefs of the Caribbean at the moment. It's something we've been flying this flag for about 7 or 8 years now. It's an incredible little organism from a scientific point of view, and that it aggressively overgrows vacant space. This is a dead Acropora palmata coral here, one of the famous staghorn corals that used to be throughout the Caribbean decades back. But more terrifyingly, it also grows over live corals. This is a Pseudodiploria strigosa here. And corals, like my very own personal obsession, Tenella chagas, the chaga brain coral, are very good at defending themselves. They have these nematocysts, these stinging cells. Nobody's paying attention to those cards, Lindsay. You know, and I'm already way past my time now, but I appreciate that. And so we're seeing that it's actually overgrowing these live corals now, and this is a real concern because these corals are under so many impacts from stresses at the moment. So when I actually started pulling apart the microbiome here, what I found that there was a single bacterial genus that was driving this massive difference in this clustering between the microbiomes, the bacterial populations of these different kind of algae. And when I looked into it, it was this bacterium called Pseudoultramonas. And Pseudoultramonas is famous for creating these chemicals, these secondary metabolites that are pheromones that are involved in the development and the recruitment and settlement of marine organisms on the sea floor. And when I looked at this in classic kind of the pinks and purple CCA, we see that it makes up a huge proportion of their populations. But when I looked at the golden crust, there was almost nothing at all. And this was bizarre. And I had to go back and check these results again. And when I looked into it, I discovered that actually this golden crust creates or produces an antibiotic, peysonoic acid, that kills the bacterium that produces the pheromones that beckons baby corals down to the seafloor. And so what we eventually have now is a golden crust taking over the Caribbean. And when it does this, and wherever it settles on the reef, it basically creates white noise for baby corals. So when those baby corals, a planula here you see, are swimming over the seafloor looking for a place to settle, they see nowhere to settle. And this is a real thing, because we're losing coral reefs at such an incredible rate at the moment. It's an amazing organism, and I say this again with the awe and respect of a biologist, seeing the way that nature is changing and finding its way. It thrives in acidic conditions, and also with increasing sea surface temperatures. It is utterly immune to hurricanes. This is Maria and Irma that swept through in 2017. And when those hurricanes swept through and knocked over all the last stands of some of the major kind of framework building corals in the Caribbean, this golden alga took over all of that vacant space. And where it takes over that space, no other corals can settle back again. This is a permanent change to those reefs. And of course, when you lose that 3D structure, you lose all of the things that make a reef special, the fish and everything else. We've also, in 8 years, never seen a single grazing fish predate upon it. And in fact, its only predator is the black spiny sea urchin, Diadema antilara, which was wiped out in the 80s by a mysterious disease, which we think might have something to do with Saharan desert dust coming across the Atlantic and settling on the Caribbean and bringing with it terrestrial pathogens. It recovered briefly till about 2014, and it's now been wiped out almost again by a second disease, the viral epidemic this time. And this, of course, is a tragedy and an absolute catastrophe for these reefs, because these are the cleaners that keep corals, they keep space available for coral. And in fact, when you look at these urchins in their little holes that they hide in during the day, terrifying at night, because the entire seafloor is a waving mass of spines. You have to be a very good diver not to check my student, seeing how good her buoyancy is. But as you can see here, they're voraciously tearing in to this golden alga. And so I returned to the Virgin Islands, this time to the British Virgin Islands, just last summer, and surveyed the reefs here. And we're essentially feeding this into some AI systems at the moment, some artificial intelligence, to spot and quantify how much of the reefs are taken over this golden alga, but also how many urchins we see, because the urchins are essentially the key to the solution. And luckily, I've just been awarded funding by the UK government as part of their Darwin Plus project to develop a strategy to control the spread of this golden alga across the Caribbean. And we really do think this is the camel that's going to break essentially the back of Caribbean reef ecology here. And so with that, these are the people I'm funded by. For some reason, the NSF logo has disappeared from there as well. They're going to be angry. I don't want to make enemies of the Americans again, I think. But you've done that, Lindsay. Wow. Persona non grata again in America. And that is me. I don't know how much I kept to time, but any questions, please go in. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely wonderful stuff. Some really inspirational work by some very inspirational people. So a big thank you to our marine biologists looking after our marine ecosystems.
I'm David Jones. Some of you have met me. I'm a trustee and I'm the sponsor of the Youth Advisory Board, but you don't need me to speak because Yasmin is here in terms of she's the chair of the Youth Advisory Board. But we're going to get you just to introduce, and this is Olivia, by the way, just going to introduce a little 4-minute film just to show you what the Youth Advisory Board have been doing. They can talk for themselves. All I can say, as somebody who's at the different end of the age spectrum, I've been blown away by their commitment, you know, how restless they are, how much they want to change. But we thought it was important you got to see and hear from them. So come and say a few words, and then you just literally, but you know that, don't you? You've got to press that button.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I just thought great to introduce ourselves and take this moment. Thank you so much. So we are the ZSL Youth Advisory Board. We've brand new, essentially. So June last year, we all kind of came together. There's 12 of us, aged between 16 and 26. Olivia is one of our members here. And yes, we're here in place to kind of raise engagement and empower the youth in the conservation field. There's been a lot of work and dedication towards this, and we're still kind of coming into our own. But there's been a lot of kind of amazing kind of things we've done, events and things too. And I'd love to share this video with you here now. And I know we are slowly coming into the ZSL community and kind of getting further awareness about us. And we're always willing to kind of collaborate and engage with us too. And yes, if you want to go further questions, please let me know. And if you want to get further engaged with the youth board, our next kind of summer intake will be next summer. So yes, please, and enjoy the video, which we made ourselves, everything with it. So thank you.
We are the Zoological Society of London's newly created Youth Advisory Board. We are a group of young individuals setting out to challenge the ZSL community with the youth perspective and to engage with other young people to inform, support and empower them in conservation. We would love to talk to you about why it is important to have youth involved in conservation and share some thoughts and ideas with you. Why is it important to engage youth in conservation?
I think it's important to engage youth in conservation because ultimately the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, all the losses to wildlife is something that impacts all of us. And it doesn't do it justice if only like a small group of people have a say in the conversation. So that's why empowering youth is so important.
I think it's important to involve the youth within any type of conversation because essentially we're the stewards of the future, and it's important to have those intergenerational conversations, which may be difficult to have. But yeah, start those conversations from young and make them what they are.
It's super important to engage youth in conservation because We are the new generation. You've got to start that education and awareness of what's happening to our world early on, because we are going to be responsible for it in the future.
I think big problems like climate change and biodiversity loss warrant more diverse perspectives. So youth are critical to that, to solving the problem of climate change and conservation.
It is incredibly important to engage youth in conservation. They bring a new sense of fresh and ideas and creativeness that is not necessarily represented in other groups. I think the youth have such an amazing way to engage social media, especially TikTok incredibly, of how to raise awareness and reach other platforms that many other groups are not able to. I believe for a company or organization to be truly diverse or inclusive, and if you truly want to hit all those target groups, then you need to engage with the youth.
So I think what a lot of people will focus on is the future of youth importance. But I also like to focus on the now, because obviously a lot of things are happening now, a lot of different issues to do with the environment and the climate. So focusing on the now is one of my key phrases for youth engagement.
What does the youth board mean to you?
Expressing myself and speaking on behalf of my community.
Empowerment.
Inclusion. For me, the Youth Advisory Board means responsibility.
Empowerment is hearing young people and lifting their voices up.
Providing opportunity.
Growth and development.
Community and hope.
Discovery of everything. It means working with like-minded people. Advocacy and awareness.
What are your hopes and aims for the board?
I really want to put accessibility at the heart of everything we do, because I think it's one of the more often overlooked elements of diversity and inclusion. So I want to make sure that absolutely everyone can access conservation, particularly any people within the young demographic who have any sorts of disabilities. I think the number one is just upping youth engagement as a whole. I mean, that's why the Youth Advisory Board was created. Number two is education, not just for children, but also for adults who believe that the zoo means something other than what it does, which is conservation.
I truly hope that we can create an active youth-led movement across wildlife conservation spaces in the UK and internationally that ensures that young people are meaningfully engaging in wildlife conservation issues.
I really want to make sure that we set up the next kind of generation of youth advisors so that they are able to continue delivering important work across the zoo.
To break down some of the barriers that young people feel are stopping them from engaging with animals on an everyday basis.
Aims and hope of YAB is to build a global, diverse and inclusive community of young conservationists with the aim of saving the world. Yes, thank you so much. And that's our email there. If you have any collaboration or any questions at all, please contact us. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. It's so nice to hear from our Youth Advisory Board. So we'll be moving on to our final lecture shortly. Just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us again. Hope you've all enjoyed your engagement sessions this afternoon. And like I said, enjoying that video and understanding what the Youth Advisory Board do. So I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Robin Freeman, for our last talk of the day. So Robin is our Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Indicators and Assessments Unit at ZSL. So his unit focuses on understanding the patterns and processes of global biodiversity change. So Robin is going to be presenting their recent analysis of 1,751 population trends of 712 species, it's a lot, from the Living Planet Index, focusing on terrestrial and freshwater birds and mammals from 1950 to 2014. You don't want me to say it all, so I'm going to bring up Robin before I give too much away. So we're excited to hear about it.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Let's see if I can get this to work. Thank you very much. And so there's a few things wrong with this slide. One is that the title's too verbose. Sorry, I'll get into what that is. And also I've got a picture of something I'm not going to talk about at all. So the reason I have that picture is that I spend about half of my time doing what I described to you today. The other half is I spend tracking seabirds and some of our recent work in Chagos. I'm happy to talk to anyone about that afterwards as well. But I'm not going to talk about tracking seabirds today. So I run the Indicators and Assessments Unit here at ZSL. We're a relatively small group. We were formed back in 2006. I arrived here about 10 years ago now. and took over from Ben Cullen, who was here before I went to UCL, we spend a lot of our time collating, managing, and disseminating data about global biodiversity trends. A lot of our work is done producing reports like the ones you see here, the Living Planet report with WWF, other reports like the Wildlife Comeback in Europe report that we did last year, and various other things about extinction risk and so on. A lot of our work feeds into global policy, but we also do a lot of work understanding the drivers of change and publishing scientific articles around that, and that's sort of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I've expanded it a bit from what I originally put in the abstract to include some stuff about languages at the end, which I think is important. So the two main products that we produce, one is the Living Planet Index, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Don't worry too much about what's on here because I'll come back to it. The other, which I won't talk about, is the IUCN Red List. So we do a lot of work assessing the extinction risk of species. That's dependent on things like population trends, geographical range size, and trying to understand how likely that species is to go extinct. And that feeds into another set of indicators. So we do a lot of work collating this data, but mostly what I'm talking to you today about is population trends. As we're aware, global biodiversity is in decline. And so here are 4 metrics of global biodiversity change. The first is the Living Planet Index, I'll focus on today. The second in the top right is extinction risk. So each of those lines represents a different set of species. The more negative, the lower that line, the more of those species are at risk of extinction. The top left, which is population trends, which is what we'll talk about today, communicates the fact that populations of wild animals are shrinking. It's not that we've lost a certain number of animals, it's that all of those populations are shrinking in size, and I'll come back to what we mean. But we're also aware that species habitats are shrinking. So the amount of space species have, the number of individuals in those populations are declining. Those species are more likely to go extinct. And another metric produced by the NHM, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, those habitats that we see now are less intact than they were 200 years ago. So all of these different ways that we measure biodiversity are all showing significant declines. The Living Planet Index that we produce here suggests that wildlife populations have shrunk on average by about 69% since 1970. We publish this every 2 years in the Living Planet report. The most recent one was 2022, which this statistic comes from. There's another one coming this September, October, with an updated statistic, which I won't talk about. This statistic gets great coverage. We've had an estimated press reach of about 11.8 billion. We get loads of mentions online. It is often significantly misunderstood. So the way I phrase that, which is that wildlife populations are shrinking, isn't that we've lost 69% of species. It isn't that we've lost 69% of animals. It's that on average, the populations have shrunk by 69%. One of the important caveats there is I can imagine a population of kakapo, a couple of hundred individuals that shrunk by half, is down to 100 individuals, or a population of starlings that started with 1 million and has shrunk to 500,000. In the statistic, we count those the same. They've both shrunk by the same amount. But in the first, you've only lost 100 individuals. In the second, you've lost 500,000. The Living Planet Index doesn't talk about how many we've lost, just that all of those populations that we can find have shrunk by on average 69%. Some have increased, some have declined more significantly, but on average, across all those systems, we see a decline of about 69%. Sorry, that's what it says in this slide. We also don't see any sign of things getting better. So I've changed the way we present this graph to more accurately present the fact that we're viewing a rate of change. And what we see is that the rate of change is reasonably consistent over time. And even when we updated that from 2020 to 2022, there wasn't much of a variation. So the trends that we're tracking are by and large staying roughly the same. There's some variation in different places that I'll talk about later, but on average, the decline is about 2% per year. Why is that happening? So the populations that we monitor, we also extract from the data sources we find the reasons for those trends. And by and large, the largest, they're all anthropogenic. The largest is habitat loss and exploitation, habitat loss and degradation, followed by exploitation. And then things like climate change are an increasing problem, but aren't as well monitored as others. So we use some of these data to ask questions about why things are changing, and I'll come into that analysis in a moment. This isn't just a problem for us conservationists. This statistic, this graph here, conveys a thing called the Global Risk Perception Survey. So the World Economic Forum asked economic leaders what they thought the most significant risks to the global economy were every year from, I think, 2010 through to 2020, and this has been updated more recently. And they asked what they were. And the green ones you see here are natural risks, things like biodiversity loss, climate change. And you can see that the shift to green being the most significant risks that they've identified is interesting. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. It means that it's not just us that worry about this. economists, global leaders are beginning to worry about this, and that's in some sense encouraging. It's not that we're observing these trends, it's that people are starting to care about them and change the decisions they make on them. The data that goes into the Living Planet Index is hosted by us. We make it freely available. We have data for almost 200 countries, and we produce national indicators for a number of different countries. So we work with the Government of Canada to produce a biodiversity indicator for Canada using our data, and we feed into other nations to produce some of their indicators too. We make it freely available. There's free tools for calculating those, and we're trying to make those more accessible so that other people can use our data to calculate those statistics too. Because we have data in the top right, it's worth mentioning each of those dots is a data point in our data set, and those have been manually extracted from papers over the last 15 years. So our group really does a Google Scholar search, finds a paper that mentions a population trend, takes the graph in that paper and digitizes the dots and feeds that into our database. It's a massive manual effort to collate all these data to produce the statistics I showed you. But what that means is we have a database that we can do a lot of different things with. So one of the things we can do is take those global trends. Oh, my numbers are all going weird. And we can look at different regions. And so while we see overall global declines of 69%, those vary significantly in different places on Earth. We see really significant declines of 94% in the Caribbean and Latin America, whereas in places like Europe and North America, we see less significant declines. That's probably because those places got rid of a lot of their biodiversity prior to 1970. Whereas the places where we see the most significant declines now are ongoing habitat loss, degradation, exploitation. We can also do different cuts of that. We can take cuts for species that we use. So this is a paper led by Louise, who's in our group. She's now a research fellow, showing that those populations of species that are utilized, or in some sense directly exploited by us in the environment, are more likely to be declining than those aren't. And the other one down here is the Forest Specialist Index, which is a particular cut of our data for those species that depend on forests, where we see declines of about 53%. So the nice thing we have about this data at ZSL is we can cut this data in different ways, we can do different analyses of it, and we can ask different questions about how biodiversity is changing over time. One of the things I'll talk about today is our ideas about how we use these data to make predictions about the future. So we've done a lot of work monitoring the demise of nature over the last 50 years. But what we want to be able to do is to make predictions about what might happen in the future, because that lets us make decisions about how we change what we do to better preserve biodiversity. So what we do is we can take all our data, and in each of those positions, we can extract things like how climate has changed, how land use has changed, whether they're inside a protected area, whether they're managed, and we can build statistical models. Don't worry too much about this, but what we found when we first did that is this. I'm going to walk all the way over here. Because habitat loss and degradation are the most commonly cited threat to biodiversity, we thought we'd see habitat loss and degradation be the thing that's driving population trends. But while that's the most commonly cited, it may not be the most influential. And what we found in this part of our data was that actually birds were declining more rapidly in places that were warming more quickly. And that changed how we thought about some of these. This isn't talking about the limits of warming, but it talks about those places that have rapidly warmed are seeing bird species decline more quickly. Because we have this statistical model, we can do some things with it. So as an international community, we have observed biodiversity decline over the last 50 years. This is kind of a cartoon that we've made where each of those yellow bars is an international agreement we made about how to conserve and limit and reduce the rate of biodiversity change. And each of those assessments of that, we didn't get it done. We failed to meet the targets that we agreed on internationally. It looks like we're going to fail to meet the targets that we've set ourselves for 2030. And so the question is, what can we do to highlight the way to let biodiversity bend the curve and recover in the future? And so I think we can use statistical models like I've described, where we know the relationship between land use, between climate, and the way populations respond, to highlight where we should protect and where we should change to let biodiversity recover. This horrible graph summarizes an amazing piece of work done by David Leclerc at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, where they have historically taken maps of the world and looked at what those maps of the world should look like under different socioeconomic pathways. So there might be different pathways about how we want to continue as usual, how we want to grow more rapidly, how we want to sustain ourselves more, and each of those produces a different map of the planet. We might put farms here, we might put protected areas here. What they did is they took those different maps and they asked how biodiversity might change under different future socioeconomic pathways. And the ones they considered were things like the baseline, which is a kind of 2-degree warming. The others are increased conservation, better protected areas, and then there's some other ones about changing the way we produce and supply food. And then the last one is basically doing everything from green down to blue. So where we better conserve the planet, we change the way we consume, and we change the way we produce food. So they have these maps, and we can take our models and apply them to those maps to look at what biodiversity would do in those different scenarios. And what we found is that only in the yellow case, where we do everything, where we better conserve the planet, we change the way we consume, and we change the way we produce, that we see biodiversity begin to recover to where it was 30, 50 years ago. Now, there's a lot of noise, a lot of error here, and what we're trying to do is to work out how to get better estimates of that. But this was done for a whole range of different biodiversity indicators, including the Living Planet Index, which is kind of the middle top. But in all of those different indicators, only where we did everything did we see biodiversity recover to the baselines we had. This is a cartoon representing the same one. So what I described to you there using these data and the models we produce sort of hides something interesting, which is the analysis we did most recently, which is that when we looked at how populations were responding to climate and land use, we measured climate and land use while those populations existed. So if you have a population of starlings over the last 50 years, we might measure climate change and land use on those 50 years. But actually, species don't respond to the warming that happened yesterday. They respond to things that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago, because it takes a while for species to respond. So we asked that question. We said, okay, if we take things like land use change, climate, and the Living Planet Index, can we look at how we lag those back? So we'll see whether we can better predict the population trends using historical data. And what we found, kind of alarming, is that particularly for larger animals, more historical better predictors of what we observe now. So for larger animals in particular, but also historical climate change, historical land use, better predict what we observe now, which highlights the fact that for some species, there are lags of 50 years in their response to the climate and land use that we observe. And that means that even if we hope to stop things right now, there's still inertia in the system. These species are still going to respond to what we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. That means we have to do it right now. Otherwise, we're not going to see the response in our lifetime. Because we have these models, we can also make predictions. So one of the things we're working on now is taking those models and applying them globally to maps to look at where populations are changing and make predictions about if you do this here, here's what we think populations will respond to, and feeding them into global models. We can also produce these pretty maps where we highlight how much of our data we've got and maybe make predictions for countries, because at the most recent international agreement, what countries want is quite simple statistics for their biodiversity. They don't want to calculate the things we're calculating. So we're trying to work out how to make our data more accessible, and the predictions we might make more accessible for those countries to consume. I'll skip over that. One of the things that we're aware of, is that this data is massively biased, and it takes us a long time to gather it. So each of those dots, you can see that we have a huge amount of data for North America and Europe, poorer data for the Middle East, poorer data for North Africa and South America. We have some data, but it's much poorer. So we've been exploring methods to try and find that data more automatically, so it doesn't require us to sit down and find papers. And so a PhD student of ours, Rich, he built some clever deep learning things to basically take our data set, look at the text and the way people describe a paper in their abstract. So I might write a paper saying global biodiversity is in decline. I've monitored a population of starlings in this place, and I see this decline. He built a model to see that using that abstract, you can identify whether a paper should be in our data set. And that means that I don't have to do the searches. I can use this tool to find those papers and put them into our data set. We still have to extract the data, but this helps us find them. And he showed that actually using both, the left-hand side is these logistic regressions, the right-hand side is these deep networks, we do quite accurately. This is more interesting. So these graphs are how quickly we can find data manually versus how quickly we can find it. Better at finding data if we use this process. So we're trying to use these tools to better build our data sets to get better estimates for biodiversity, particularly in those places where we have poorer data. However, machine learning is a tricky beast. So if I look at the way those models like to find data, when people in the top left, you see the kind of bits of words that it likes to find. And so the classifier we had for the Living Planet Index, the other side is a different data set. likes to find populations, abundance, great, but also likes the word declines, because everybody starts their paper, global biodiversity is in decline, like I did this talk, and then talks about what they did. And so the classifier thinks that papers that talk about declines are the ones we want, whereas actually we want papers that talk about everything. And so we have to think carefully about how we use these models to find data, otherwise we'll end up exacerbating the biases we find in the data. Speaking of biases, biodiversity literature by and large is massively biased towards English languages, the data we find. There's a huge repository of data in non-English languages which is available to us. This is a graph from Tatsuya Amano's paper a few years ago showing that actually only about 64% of biodiversity literature is written in English. So there's this 35% of the data we might want is hidden away in other languages. And as horrible monoglottish Anglophile speakers, it's very hard for me to find that data. So what we need is to either find ways to make that data more accessible and to engage in people in countries and who speak other languages to find those data. So one of the ways we've done that is work with colleagues in Brazil, most recently. So Valentina Marconi and our team got a grant from the British Ecological Society to help fund Felipe, who's a postdoc in Brazil, to help compare biodiversity data written in Portuguese, published domestically, with what we would see from an international perspective. And so what he did is he went out and he screened 34 different Brazilian journals and compared that to all the data we had in international, and then looked at which of those data sets for which species there were and calculated some LPIs. Interestingly, for Brazilian species, you much more rapidly find the greater richness in domestic language journals, which is great. So if we had only looked in international journals for Brazilian species, we wouldn't see enough species. But also more interestingly, we see a greater diversity of species too. So particularly the data we add for most species is massively increased by this process, but they don't overlap, which is quite interesting. So actually we found a whole set of unique species that we didn't see in the international literature published in domestic journals. And so we're definitely missing both taxonomic and geographical things by looking only in English language journals. And there's some suggestion, although it's relatively early days, that those trends might be doing different things. That people might publish different kinds of trends in domestic journals than they publish in international journals. And maybe that's because you've done a very long-term study of birds, and that's something you can publish internationally, but birds tend to be doing a bit better than reptiles and amphibians. Or maybe it's that small populations that have been monitored not as well get published domestically because they don't get international journals. We don't know yet. So some of the things we're thinking about is how we can free up some of these to better build our database. We can also use some of the automatic tools we found to dig into those. So taking those classifiers, those machine learning tools to do automatic translation. The paper I showed you from 2001 that Rich wrote, we had another paper in 2002. I can already do both of those papers automatically in ChatGPT. I don't have to code anything myself. I can just ask ChatGPT if this abstract is something I have to have in the LPI, and it says, sure, this looks like an LPI paper. So the advent of these things like large language models will dramatically change the way we find and mobilize data, and I think there's great opportunities coming there. Hopefully that will help us deal with some of the bias, some of the kind of missing biodiversity trends, and hopefully by doing that, we can better enable models that help us identify how to bend the curve of biodiversity loss.
Fantastic, super, super interesting stuff and very inspiring to hear about the data and science informing all of the work that we do at ZSL. So huge thank you to Robin. So we do have another chance now for a Q&A. So if you guys didn't scan the QR code earlier, or if you've lost the page, then feel free to scan that now and start sending your questions through. But just to start off with, whilst the questions come through on there, does anyone have a question they want to put their hand up for? Instantly, I'll come on over with a mic.
Very interesting talk, by the way. I'm a computer scientist. One thing that's really sort of hit me is there's one mammal that's not mentioned in the data set, and that's us, humans. A very interesting ratio index comes to me is what is the ratio index of for per country with the data you have, with the data set, with the actual population of us humans? That might be an interesting, have you thought about that?
We've talked about it a few times. I think we see kind of a more than halving of global wildlife populations over the last 50 years, and I think roughly human populations have doubled. And so a colleague of ours, Chris Carbone, we've kind of idly thought about whether there's something interesting there about the kind of the energy transfer that's happening. I think it's tricky though, because one of the problems we see is that we might not have increased our population very dramatically in the UK over the last 50 years, but the impact we've had internationally in terms of biodiversity loss has been dramatic because we basically outsourced our resource consumption. And so countries that might have become more populous per capita have a lower impact, whereas we who haven't become more populous are outsourcing our impact to those countries. And I think to do that responsibly, we need to disentangle that problem a little bit, because the stuff we consume now isn't from the UK, and we don't see a big decline. What's happening is that we're causing declines overseas, but being kind of anonymous. It would be interesting.
Okay, fantastic. Very interesting. I'm going to come to the front for another one on mic, and then I'll head to Slido.
We had a talk this morning about legal requirements to conserve. For the last God knows how many decades, I've been totally frustrated that we constantly miss the targets. Is there anything you could say on that one? I mean, it's probably an obvious question, but.
So I think there has been a great effort and a great change in the UK in ensuring that there's a legal requirement to meet some of the targets. And I think there's an indicator like the Living Planet Index, the species, I think it's the Britain Species Index it's called in the UK, that has now been kind of enshrined in law as we need to make sure this increases by a certain amount. I think that's great. I think that's happening few and far between across countries. And I think that unless we are able to mobilize the social pressure to make governments understand that we care about these issues, it's unlikely that governments are going to try and hit these targets. Well, we were chatting to someone yesterday about the idea that there's a lot of discussion at the moment about tipping points. And so there are various tipping points in nature. And I think that unless we can ensure that the social tipping points, the time at which we care about those issues, are to the right side of those tipping points, we're going to be quite stuck. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how to achieve that apart from better communication, encouraging people to get involved, write to your MP. I think that's probably more important than the small things we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. So coming in from Slido, we've got one saying, if I was interested in working with assessments, what recommendations would you give?
Good question. So I was actually a computer scientist originally. My undergrad is computer science. I realized I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk. I think I find myself stuck behind a desk, but that's, I occasionally get to go out in the field, which is nice. I think one of the things I would say is that there's a place for everyone in conservation. So whether your passion is computer science, whether your passion is field work, whether your passion is art, in order to conserve the planet, we need all those people. And so just get involved, find a way to get involved. There's people in every country who need to better conserve species. You can get involved in how to assess that, get involved in doing one assessment. Look at the IUCN, there's lots of ways to go.
Amazing. We'd always say that with conservation, there's a lot of different ways in, just getting your foot in the door. So another one from Slido, we have got someone asking, any chance of fungi joining the data sets, or is there just not enough research on them?
That would be lovely. So it may not have been clear, but at the moment it's just vertebrates, never mind animals. And so we have recently done a global assessment of butterflies with some colleagues from NHM and CH. Fungi would be great. I think that's further away. It's less clear to me how you would measure them in the same way that it would. I think we need to understand for many species of fungi, their extinction risk. Probably first is the best thing we can do. But population trends, I guess there's probably a way to do it.
I'm sure, very interesting. I think someone's got a little hint for something that's happening soon, because someone said, what is the next big assessment for the team? I believe there's something big landing in September, October.
In September, October is the next edition of the Living Planet report. That's the report I mentioned that tends to get quite good coverage with our collaboration with WWF. The newest one of them is coming out, I think, September, October time. We're finishing up our text for that just now. Keep an eye out. I think it's happening between some of the big events happening September 4th.
Okay, do we have any other questions in the room before I throw another one out to Slido? Yes.
You mentioned it, or you touched on it briefly. What are your plans for using AI going forward to help with the data sets you were talking about, and also further information, and particularly what you were saying about the language barrier?
A great question, and I can probably, as an aside to that, we were fortunate enough to be awarded a grant from BSIT just before Christmas for a large deep learning cluster, which we're hoping to install in the next 6 months. that will dramatically change the capability of the organization to do some of the AI things we want, and I think place us in a position to collaborate more widely with AI experts. I think for us, there's a lot of scope for using language models. One of the things that worries me a bit about ChatGPT, for example, is that I can't tell if it's changed. So I might use it to do something amazing, and then the next day it doesn't do the same thing, and I can't publish that. I need models that I can have on my desktop or my computer that I can repeatably use in a scientific way. And I think that's changing. Things like Lambda that came out last week enable us to use open source tools to do that. And I think there's great scope for using those models to mobilize data from documents, to describe some of the things like species assessment. So I think that's great. It would be great to have the resources here to do that, which we should have in 6 months. But that applies across the society. So colleagues who are doing Hogwatch, as an example, when they do a survey of Hampstead Heath, Hampstead Heath, 150 cameras, they produce 1.6 million images. And there's no way you can go through those images manually. It'll take you, I think if it took one person 2.5 months, you needed 5 people, from we had, you'd be doing it for a year. With the tools that we can use to those systems, we can reduce that to about a month in total, and that's not even identifying the species, that's just getting animals in. And so I think as the amount of data that we produce, both with camera traps, acoustic recorders, animal tracking devices, data here, we're going to need those tools to process that data to get the insight.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I've got quite a broad question here. So someone's asked, how do you make these predictions? So assuming we're talking about like the future of these species, what sorts of things are you looking for to make those predictions about them?
So the way that there's a variety of ways we can make those predictions. So in the statistical models I described there, we take the things like the rate of climate change and the rate of land use change, so the more anthropogenic the land is becoming in a cell, and we know that there was a population of animals in that cell, or maybe more, and we see that there's some correlation between them. So when land use gets worse or climate change gets worse, we see the population decline, and when land use gets better, we see the population respond. Across all of the populations we have, we see some average response, and maybe that varies with species. We then use that model to make predictions for species in places where we don't have data. And that allows us to make predictions about what might be happening in places without data, but also to make predictions for the future of populations in the places we have based upon scenarios of land use. At the moment, those are relatively simple regressions, but I think there's great opportunity to make them a bit more sophisticated with AI.
Amazing, very interesting. So one last check, is there any other questions that we've got in the room? No, I think you've been comprehensive. Thank you so much, Robin. It's been super interesting. Thank you for answering all of our questions. Okay, so that wraps up our final talk of the day. I'm just going to welcome back Jim up to the stage for our closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Maisie. I think it's been a terrific day, and I want to thank all the speakers, every trustee, everybody who's taken part in the various engagement sessions. In fact, I think I might even read the names out at the risk of being tedious, because I think it has been so wonderful. Rob just now, Fiona this morning from ZSL, the speakers who gave their talks just before lunch, Ross, Martin, Brian, Ray and Bethany. Thank you for sticking to time as well. You know, 10 minutes is the hardest time to speak for, actually, because you think, oh, I'm just squeeze in 12. But if everybody does that, then you overrun disastrously. So thanks for sticking to time there. I think the engagement sessions, I was in one, so I couldn't go to them all, unfortunately, but I would really have liked to have done so. Sarah Forsyth, Rob Fitzgerald, Claire McCowan talking about master planning, Colette Gibbons, Stephanie Isaac, ZSL 200, and Tina Campanella, those of you who went there, and Natasha Wakely in the library. Fantastic stuff. I'd like to thank my fellow trustees. You're still here, David. Peter's still here. I don't know if Paul is still here. I know Lorraine has had to go, and Richard Kimblin, I don't know if he's still here. But anyway, thanks for taking part. And you know, the message that came across to me from the engagement sessions I was in, from the talks that I heard, and from just the conversations that I have had throughout, have emphasized to me something, Rob, you said just now, which I wrote down and which I'll repeat, is that we need the range of people with the different skills and interests to achieve the mission we have set ourselves, ZSL's mission. And it's this range of people here today, meeting each other, speaking to each other, interacting, discussing, that really help us achieve what we want to achieve. I said first thing this morning that this is the first of these meetings held, at least in living memory. And it's a shock to me that we haven't done it before. And this will not be the last time. I think it's been fantastic. And to achieve what we've achieved, I particularly want to thank Topaz Reed. I want to thank Amelia Coutts, Scudamore, who I don't know is still here, but Amelia, thank you for what you've done. Macy, who you've seen a lot of, thanks for your brilliant coordination. Maybe for Macy. But most of all, Lindsay Isaac, who I've told you that I'm going to ask you to stand up. So she's going to stand up. Lindsay Isaac, who's arranged this whole thing. So Lindsay. I think it's been brilliant. So Lindsay, thank you so much for all you've done. And I'm afraid the success means that you're going to have to do it again. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks everybody for being as diverse as you are. And I think we have drinks outside now. Thanks very much.